July 25, 2018. Brenda Pájaro Bruno, a 44-year-old mother of 4, leaves her home in the Costa Hermosa neighborhood of Soledad in Barranquilla, Colombia, at around 1 p.m. She heads over to the Sonrisa de Esperanza Rehabilitation Center, where her daughter Miriam receives regular treatment for cerebral palsy. She leaves Miriam in the care of the nurses at the center so she can step out and run a few errands, something she's done countless times before. But this time, she doesn't return to pick her daughter up. When Brenda still hasn't come back by the end of the day, one of the nurses takes Miriam home. And at first, Brenda's family isn't actually too worried. They know she has a dance rehearsal at her church that evening, so assume that's where she's gone. But as night falls and there's still no sign of her, concern begins to set in. By the next morning, with no response to their texts and still no trace of her, her family contacts the police. The authorities initially dismiss them, but as the hours turn to days, they realize something isn't right, and a full-scale search operation is launched. As her family and friends distribute flyers across the region, tips and reported sightings start flooding in. But one by one, they all lead nowhere. It isn't until more than a month after she vanished, on August 28th, that searchers finally find Brenda. But tragically, it's not the outcome anyone was hoping for. Brenda's badly decomposed body is discovered in a wooded area beside a road in Miramar on the outskirts of Barranquilla. Her body shows clear signs of violence and assault, including a fatal head wound, and it isn't long before her autopsy confirms what investigators already suspect. Brenda was murdered on the very same day she disappeared. But what shocks investigators even more is what was done to her body after she'd been killed. The killer had mutilated her, removing part of her middle and ring fingers to pose her hand in the shape of devil horns. Local sources, including the police, seem to refer to this gesture as the sign of Vor, an occult symbol supposedly linked to a demon summoning ritual, likely inspired by the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. The letter Z had been carved into her forehead, and nearby a pentagram was found etched into the ground, leading investigators to conclude that Brenda had been the victim of some sort of satanic ritual. But even more disturbingly, this isn't the first time investigators in the region have seen this kind of thing. In fact, between 2002 and 2012, there were at least 10 unsolved murders in the Barranquilla area that featured the same brutal hallmarks of ritual mutilation and satanic symbolism. But this time, the serial killer responsible made a fatal mistake. And having evaded capture for at least 16 years, the hidden life of the family man responsible and his supposed deal with the devil was about to come to light. This is the story of El Satanico, or in English, the Satanist. After showing Brenda's family some of the personal items found with the body and confirming a match through dental records, police officially identified the remains as belonging to her. With that confirmation, they immediately turned their attention to the day she disappeared. And it wasn't long before they uncovered a crucial lead. The rehabilitation center where Brenda dropped off her daughter had a security camera. On the footage, investigators were able to identify Brenda arriving with her daughter before leaving a short time later alone and getting into a white Chevy van with a dented bumper, alongside an unknown man. The investigators speculated that Brenda was having an affair with this man, given how willingly she appeared to go with him, though her family adamantly denied that being the case. This same van was picked up by other security cameras, heading toward the wooded area in Miramar where Brenda's body was eventually found. On the footage, Brenda and the man can be seen getting out of the vehicle together and walking into the trees. 64 minutes later, the man reappears alone, with Brenda nowhere in sight. And around that exact same time, her phone stopped transmitting GPS data, strongly suggesting it was the moment she'd been killed. Investigators traced the license plate on the van and found it was registered to a woman whose husband just so happened to be someone Brenda knew, a man her family also knew extremely well. His name was Tomás Maldonado Cera, and he was a taxi driver. But not just any taxi driver, he worked for the rehabilitation center where Brenda took Miriam for treatment. Once they confirmed that Tomás was the man captured in the surveillance footage, investigators moved quickly. They arrested him at his home, using the footage to formally charge him in connection with Brenda's death, placing him in pretrial detention at El Bosque prison. Authorities reportedly found a wide range of occult objects at his house, including books, jewelry, and even what they described as a satanic altar, though the exact details of what they discovered seems to be a little unclear. Tomás's 78-year-old father, German, was stunned. He told the press, "Everything they're saying about him is a lie. He didn't do that. He never had a romantic relationship with Brenda. He is a married man with 4 children. He's a hard worker who drives for a living, so I do not know why he is being linked to this." Tomás's arrest also shocked the staff at the rehabilitation center. His colleagues described him as perfectly normal, and even called him respectful, polite, and professional. They all told the detectives that he'd never behaved inappropriately with them, and that they'd never seen him behaving inappropriately with any of the mothers whose children he transported every day either. Brenda's family was equally baffled. Her eldest daughter, Gisela, said, "He didn't seem like a bad person at all. He was friendly, he talked to us, he laughed. I don't understand how someone who works with children could be capable of murder." But despite his outward appearance as a hard-working family man, as the investigators began digging into Tomás's past, they discovered he had a long history of run-ins with the law. His record included charges ranging from theft to illegal possession of weapons. But most concerning, they discovered he'd actually been convicted in 1996 for stabbing a security guard in the neck. Although he'd been sentenced to 12 years in prison for the crime, an appeal had led to his verdict being overturned, allowing him to walk free. Given the unusual nature of Brenda's murder, with clear satanic imagery implying she'd been ritualistically sacrificed, police had a hard time believing this was just a spontaneous crime of passion. Tomás himself provided no help, denying any involvement in her death and refusing to answer any of their questions. So with the assistance of the Colombian Directorate of Criminal Investigation and Interpol, the police began looking to see if any similar cases had occurred in the area. And what they uncovered was deeply unsettling, to say the least. They found a pattern of unsolved murders dating back more than 15 years. Just like Brenda, several victims had 2 fingers removed and posed in the now infamous Vor symbol. Each had satanic symbols carved into their skin, with more symbols found near their bodies. But most chillingly of all, it turned out that every single victim had known Tomás. That connection, and the clear links between the disturbing ritualistic details of the cases with Brenda's murder, led both the investigators and the press to give him a new nickname: El Satanico, the Satanist. On July 26, 2002, the body of 28-year-old cosmetologist Roberto Antonio Bolaño Ortega, a well-known member of the LGBTQ+ community, was found partially undressed in Punta Roca. He'd been killed with a sharp blade, and his body was marked with satanic symbols, including a pentagram, and more symbols were found drawn in the sand around his body. Then on September 5, 2002, the body of 31-year-old Rolando Rufan Romero was discovered in a wooded area near One Mina. His throat had been slit and he'd suffered at least 25 stab wounds. Once again, investigators found satanic symbols at the scene, including a pentagram carved into his cheek and the letter Z etched into his forehead. Both were believed to have been done post-mortem. It would later be discovered that a phone number found on a note in his possession belonged to Tomás, with his sister then confirming the two of them were close friends. Only 2 weeks after that, on September 18, 2002, 15-year-old Jason Ariza Banquez was found dead in the dense overgrowth near a roadside by the Salga Beach Resort. His body bore eerily similar wounds, with satanic symbols carved into his skin, though his exact cause of death couldn't be determined. All 3 of these victims, whose cases had gone cold more than a decade earlier, had lived in the same neighborhood as Tomás at the time. While he'd never been considered a suspect back then, investigators now discovered that all of them had personally known him. There were even indications that some of them may have had homosexual relationships with him. Then, on November 29th of that same year, another body was found: 17-year-old Miguel Alfonso Gil Rodriguez. He was discovered in the bushes on the same road to Salgar, near Lagos de Caujaral. However, his body was severely decomposed, likely having been there since at least early October, before it was finally found. The next murder tied to Tomás didn't occur until nearly a year later. In September 2003, 34-year-old bakery owner Aida Rocio Antolines Lizarazo was found dead in the Punta Roca area of Salgar. She'd gone missing a month earlier, and her body had been badly mutilated by her killer. A close friend of Tomás, Aida was someone he was often seen drinking and socializing with. And then, in February 2004, another body was discovered: 24-year-old Yilibeth Irina Manjares Almorales. Found by Salgar police, again in the Punta Roca area, Yilibeth was a market vendor who sold watches and other goods in the El Bosque neighborhood of Barranquilla. The initial investigation uncovered a connection to a man named Tomás, though his full identity wasn't confirmed at the time. According to her friends and family, Tomás was a security guard who'd been in a relationship with her. He'd even told her they would get married in December. When she asked why December, since it had already passed, he reportedly gave a chilling reply, implying that there might not be any more Decembers for her. Yelibeth's murder was especially brutal. She'd been stabbed dozens of times, her fingers had been severed, her hair was cut off, a hole had been punched into her skull, and a large pentagram had been carved across the entire surface of her back. After Tomás was arrested, her family confirmed he was the same man she'd been involved with at the time of her murder. It's difficult to determine exactly what symbols or injuries were found on each of the victims, other than where it's very specifically detailed. This is in part due to the cases only being covered in Colombia and there being limited available information out there on them. But reports indicate that all of them had satanic symbols carved into their skin, including pentagrams, hexagrams, and the letter Z. Each apparently showed signs of ritualistic mutilation, and were found near satanic symbols drawn in sand, dirt, or on nearby walls. Police also reported finding incense and candles, alongside other items commonly used in occult rituals, at every crime scene. It seems that these 6 cases, marked by similar mutilation and symbolism, clustered within the same geographic area and time frame, were believed at the time to be connected, and likely the work of one killer or a group involved in satanic rituals. But with no suspects ever identified, the cases eventually went cold. All 6 of the victims were either women or gay men believed to have had some form of relationship with Tomás, making it easy for him to lure them out into secluded areas. Like Brenda, it isn't believed he forced anyone to go with him. Instead, investigators think that Tomás turned on his companions when they were alone together, before assaulting them, killing them, and performing some form of ritual using their bodies. Initially, investigators believed these 6 murders were all Tomás was responsible for, but over time, more potential victims emerged. After seeing his face on the news, the family of Yadira Martinez Gutierrez came forward, believing he was also responsible for her disappearance in October 2002, during the same period as many of the other murders. Yadira had been in a relationship with Tomás, and on the day she vanished, she left her apartment on a motorcycle with him, telling her family they were going to visit a friend. That was the last time anybody ever saw her. After she was reported missing, Tomás returned to her apartment, asking for money and some of her clothes, telling them Yadira had sent him to collect them. At the time, her family believed she might still be alive. But when they never heard from her or Tomás again, they began to suspect he was involved in whatever had happened to her. Still, with no body ever found and no hard evidence, police never treated her case as a homicide. At least not until the family saw Tomás's face in a newspaper following the murder of Brenda, and they were able to connect him to it. Alongside Yadira's suspected murder, investigators also linked Tomás to the death of 13-year-old Osnaida David Gutierrez Ortiz. His body was discovered in an abandoned house in Punta Roca in March 2012, with his throat having been slit. While his murder hadn't been connected to the earlier cases, reports claim there was evidence of satanic rituals at the crime scene, though I couldn't determine specifically what this entailed. And while no direct relationship with Tomás was made with Osnaida, they just so happened to live in the same neighborhood, and his body was found close to where several of Tomás's other alleged victims had been discovered in the early 2000s. Some reports suggest Tomás may have been considered a suspect in some of these unsolved cases at the time they occurred. But ultimately, no solid evidence ever tied him to the crimes, beyond circumstantial connections. Given specific details on the case are limited, and what is available is not in English, and so suffers from potential mistranslation on my part, it's unclear to what degree police viewed Tomás as a genuine suspect, if at all, in these murders when they happened. Some reports seem to indicate he was involved in hearings for some of these cases, while others imply police had no awareness of who he was until Brenda's murder. It's also worth noting that Colombia had very limited CCTV infrastructure back in the early 2000s, which likely played a major role in why the earlier murders remained unsolved. In contrast, CCTV footage proved crucial in cracking Brenda's case, finally giving investigators the lead they needed to identify the man now known as El Satanico. Despite the lack of hard evidence, several victims' families had long believed Tomás was responsible for their loved ones' deaths. One relative even claimed that Tomás had openly confessed back in the early 2000s that he'd made a pact with the devil and that he needed to kill before Halloween for it to work. Whether that's true or not is still up for debate, but it's worth noting that every known murder linked to Tomás occurred before October, and the investigators involved in his case do seem to genuinely believe that this connection to Halloween was a real part of his ritual. In February 2019, pre-trial hearings were held at the Barranquilla Judicial Service Center. Prosecutor Elkin Chico Povea revealed to the nation that while Tomás was being investigated as a suspect in at least 6 satanic-style murders, he was, at that point, only officially being charged in connection with the assault and murder of Brenda. However, Elkin made it clear that they were viewing Tomás as a serial killer and stated that they'd uncovered fingerprint evidence that connected him to several of the other cases. Though if this is true, I wasn't able to find any further information about it. Tensions were high during the hearing. Brenda's family and friends clashed with members of Tomás's own family, who continued to vehemently deny his involvement in any of the crimes he'd been connected to. Families of other alleged victims also attended the hearing, hoping for answers, including the son of Yadira, who shouted at Tomás as he was escorted into the courtroom, demanding to know what he'd done with his mother's body. In a bizarre moment, Tomás is said to have offered his blessings to the courtroom before the trial began, which many onlookers took as an act of mockery. After being charged with aggravated robbery, aggravated murder, and sexual assault, Tomás pled not guilty, telling Judge Nesta Primera, "With all due respect, I declare myself innocent." That was in spite of the overwhelming evidence presented against him, including witness testimonies, cell phone data, and various pieces of forensic evidence. Not to mention the security footage showing him driving Brenda to the location where she was murdered, before leaving without her. Given the severity of the charges, the prosecution requested that Tomás remain in custody until his formal trial could begin. However, as the trial faced multiple delays, in part due to the outbreak of COVID-19, Tomás's defense began mounting appeals for him to be released. While I couldn't figure out the exact workings of Colombia's legal system, it appears that there's a maximum time someone can be held before trial under a provision known as preventive detention, and that window had already expired. Although the Attorney General's office and the prosecution pushed to extend his detention, they reportedly failed to submit the necessary paperwork in time. This opened the door for Tomás's defense to argue for his release, which shockingly the court granted, requiring only that he post a bond roughly equivalent to half a year's wages to be released. However, before he could set a foot out of jail, police served him with a new arrest warrant, this time in connection to Yadira's disappearance. The warrant was based on fresh testimony and newly uncovered evidence linking him to her case. As a result, Tomás never actually saw a single day outside of prison, despite the ruling. Finally, in August 2023, Tomás's long-delayed trial for Brenda's murder began in the 9th Criminal Circuit Court. The case involved testimony from around 40 witnesses and included over 150 pieces of evidence. A psychologist who evaluated Tomás painted a chilling portrait of him for the court, saying he displayed no remorse, no empathy, and no respect for human life. The psychologist also suggested that Tomás exhibited traits consistent with psychopathy and narcissism. Prosecutors went a step further, claiming he showed pride in his crimes and had even mocked the families of his alleged victims over the years, including attending their funerals and inquiring with their families about what happened to them. They portrayed Tomás as a violent predator with twisted beliefs, who murdered Brenda and his other alleged victims as part of a satanic ritual. But in the end, it was the video footage that sealed his fate. It matched up perfectly with Brenda's cell phone data and time of death, leaving no doubt that Tomás had been alone with her when she was murdered. And as a result, he was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 46 years in prison for her assault and murder. A sentence that is one of the longest ever handed down for murder in Colombia's Caribbean region, according to reports. Then in November 2024, Tomás was also tried and found guilty for the forced disappearance of Yadira, receiving an additional 31-year prison sentence. As far as I can tell, no other charges relating to the remaining murders Tomás is believed to have committed have been filed so far. While most Colombian sources appear to treat it as fact that Tomás, or El Satanico, was a serial killer responsible for at least 10 murders dating back to 2002, it's unclear whether there's any direct evidence linking him to those earlier crimes, beyond the circumstantial connections he had with many of the victims. The precise facts and details of the case have been very hard to verify, so while it seems pretty clear Tomás was responsible for the murder of Brenda, it's difficult to know how solid the case against him as a satanic serial killer truly is. Still, if the claims made by investigators and journalists over the years are accurate, that multiple victims had matching injuries, such as mutilated hands or the letter Z carved into their faces, and that they all knew Tomás, then it becomes increasingly difficult not to see their cases as connected to Brenda's, and to see Tomás as a disturbed serial killer who engaged in ritualistic killings. If Tomás is responsible, it seems unlikely to me that he killed multiple people in the early 2000s, then suddenly took a decade-long break, suggesting instead that there may be many, many more victims out there who've simply never been found, just like Yadira. And with that, our exploration of this unnerving case comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe and do all that stuff that appeases the algorithm gods. If any of you watching right now are from Colombia and have more information about the case, please let me know down in the comments section below. I've tried my best to piece everything together, but because this case hasn't received much attention outside of Colombia, I've had to rely on translated news articles, which all but guarantees some of the details will have gotten jumbled and distorted. If I'm able to dig up more information in the future, I'll try to do a follow-up or give updates down below, especially since it seems the case against Tomás as a serial killer is still ongoing. If you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked in the description you can check out too. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. May 18, 2008. In the small Russian town of Naro-Fominsk, Maria Veselova is walking with some friends near the Latishskaya train station. Having come down for the weekend with her parents to celebrate her 16th birthday, she's expected back at their suburban dacha by 7 p.m, so they can all return to Moscow together later that evening. So just before 7, she hugs her friends goodbye and begins walking down a narrow path back towards her family's dacha. The path is a well-known shortcut used by commuters, which runs along the tracks and dips through a thin belt of trees before opening back toward the residential streets. It's quiet, isolated, yet still surrounded by the safety of the town. It's walked all day, every day, and nothing bad ever happens. Except on this evening, a man has been watching Maria and her friends, and the second he sees her split from the group and head down the path alone, he starts to follow her. The man closes the distance between them quickly, reaching her as she enters the tree line. Before she likely even knows anything is wrong, he wraps a cord around her throat and pulls it tightly, choking her. Then he starts to stab her with a knife, over and over, in a swift but brutal attack. And when he's finished, he discards her body in the brush, before he slinks into the belt of trees and vanishes. 7 p.m. comes and goes. Maria's phone rings again and again, but of course she doesn't answer. So her parents put on their shoes and head outside, taking the most direct route from their dacha towards the train station. They even take the exact same shortcut Maria had, but they find nothing, walking right past their daughter's dead body, unable to see it in the dark. With police called to help, it isn't until the next morning that the searchers locate her body in the tree belt. While it's clear the attack was extremely vicious, the investigators have very little to go off. There is no evidence of sexual assault, no money or valuables have been stolen, and there's barely even signs of a struggle. There are no cameras, no witnesses, nobody in the nearby houses who even heard anything. There's just nothing. But based on the timeline of events they do know, it seems clear that Maria was killed almost immediately after leaving her friends. Whoever did this acted quickly and didn't hesitate. But with no motive and no leads at all, it isn't long before the case starts to turn cold. So at first it just seems like an isolated incident, a freak, terrible thing. But it isn't. Because over the next 4 months, 2 more young women will be killed in Naro-Fominsk by the same serial killer responsible for Maria's murder. And to make sure nobody doubts that he's the one behind the brutal killings, he leaves an item stolen from the previous victim at each of his new crime scenes. Shockingly, the man responsible is actually a police officer from a wealthy family, who even more shockingly claims that he was acting on the orders of somebody else when he committed his murders. And that somebody isn't any old regular person. According to him, he was murdering at the command of Lucifer, the devil himself. But before anyone knows that, or even knows his real name, the public and the press give the predator lurking in the streets of their small town their own nickname. This is the story of the Naro-Fominsk Maniac. On June 21st, around a month after the murder of Maria, 22-year-old Marina Karpenko went to sit an exam paper at a branch of the Humanitarian Academy near Alabino Station on the Kievsky line. After finishing the exam, she phoned her husband Alexei at around 11:30 in the morning, asking him to come meet her. Rather than driving up to the institute itself to pick her up, they arranged to meet on the other side of the tracks, to avoid Alexei getting stuck in the busy traffic at the railway crossing. It was only a short walk for her, less than 10 minutes, which cut through an industrial zone and a belt of trees by the railway tracks. But when Alexei arrived at the meeting place a few minutes later, there was no sign of his wife. He tried to call her, but she didn't answer. And at first he didn't think much of it. Maybe she'd stopped to chat to one of her friends at the institute. But after waiting a few more minutes, she still hadn't shown up. And now when he tried to call her phone again, it was suddenly switched off. Growing concerned, Alexei got out and headed down the route his wife should have taken. But he couldn't find any sign of her. At the institute, he was told that she left, but that's all they knew. He drove around looking for her for a bit, but she'd seemingly vanished. And when he tried to get the police to help him, they dismissed him, telling him it hadn't been long enough for him to file a missing person report and that they wouldn't take a statement from him yet. So he called the couple's friends and family, who all rushed to the area to help him search for his missing wife. It wasn't until the next morning that they found her, and sadly it wasn't the outcome anyone had been hoping for. Her body was found covered by branches in the tree belt near the station, lying face down in the grass. Just like with Maria, when the police examined her body, they found ligature marks across her neck, followed by multiple stab wounds. And once again, there were no witnesses to the crime, and they found no signs of robbery or sexual assault. The police now had 2 murders in just over a month. Both were near Kievsky Line train stations. Both occurred in the daytime in a matter of minutes, and both showed the same sequence of injuries: strangulation followed by stabbing. If that hadn't been enough to confirm that the same killer was responsible, something else at the scene made damn sure that the investigators knew it. There was a ballpoint pen found next to her body, a pen that belonged to the first victim, Maria. But even though there was no doubt that the same killer was responsible for the murders of both young women, the investigators didn't have a single shred of evidence to point them towards a suspect. So rumours and fear spread through the community, and it wasn't long before the press gave the killer a nickname of their own: the Station Strangler. It wasn't until September that the killer struck again. On September 10th, 20-year-old Olga Parokina was working as a nurse at the Orbita boarding house on the edge of Naro-Fominsk. According to her mother, Nina Mikhalina, she had been severely ill the day before and had only gone into work that day to make sure she didn't lose her vacation pay. Olga regularly worked alone in the treatment room, and unfortunately, the killer had been watching her, observing her, and learning when she would be in there by herself. That afternoon, he snuck into the nursing home somehow and ambushed Olga in the treatment room. He strangled her, and then he stabbed her multiple times with a knife, killing her. He then dragged her body to an adjacent bathroom by her hair and closed her inside. Some reports claim it wasn't until the following day that her colleagues came across the horrific scene of Olga's body lying in a pool of blood. Other accounts state that the police forced management to open the building that same night after she didn't return home, and after searching room by room, they were the ones who found her. It's unclear to me which sequence of events is true, but either way the outcome was the same. While there were elements of Olga's murder that differed from the first 2 attacks, the killer made it easy for the investigators to know that it was once again his handiwork. Because beside her body, he left a watch that had been taken from Marina when he killed her. Olga had last been seen alive in the accounting room by some of her colleagues at around 4 p.m. And given when the building was locked up for the night, it once again left a very narrow window for the killer to have made his attack. Whoever this was, he moved quickly, skillfully, and ruthlessly. Yet once again, they weren't able to identify a single suspect, or find any evidence pointing them towards the serial killer responsible, who was now being called the Naro-Fominsk Maniac in the press. At least not until the following April. In April 2009, a man wearing a mask walked into a small grocery store in Petrovskoye village in Naro-Fominsk and forced the female cashier to give him everything in the till at knife point, around 250 rubles. But as he attempted to flee the scene, a group of young villagers noticed the commotion and pursued him, managing to tackle him to the ground. As they disarmed him of his knife and removed his mask, the robber shouted for them to let him go, telling them he hadn't robbed or killed anyone. Given nobody was accusing him of murder, this struck the villagers as strange. And when police arrived to arrest him for the robbery, they felt the same way. There was no doubt he'd committed the armed robbery. He had the knife on him, the stolen cash on him, and he'd been witnessed doing it by a large group of villagers. And alongside his strange remark about having not killed anybody, the police would have probably had enough reason to search his address. But when they took the man back to the station and identified him, things took a much more serious turn. They discovered that he was a local man from the town called Andrei Surikov. He was an ex-police sergeant who'd worked for the traffic police. And while in most situations like this, that would have been a shocking revelation, it was nothing compared to what else the detectives learnt about him. Because Andrei had actually spent the last several years confined in a psychiatric ward, having been found mentally incompetent to stand trial. The crime he'd been arrested for in that instance was attempted murder, an attempted murder that involved strangulation with a cord, followed by multiple stab wounds. So the investigators began to question him as a potential suspect in their serial killer case. But Andrei adamantly denied any involvement in the murders and refused to admit to anything beyond the failed robbery attempt. And in reality, they didn't actually have anything connecting him to the 3 murders. And anyway, would a wanted serial killer really be so stupid as to rob a grocery store in front of multiple witnesses while being hunted by the police? But if he actually was their killer, and if he really was that stupid, did that mean there was a chance the knife he had on him was the same one used to kill the victims? The knife was quickly handed over to forensic experts, but it didn't match the wounds on the 3 victims of the Naro-Fominsk Maniac. The knife they found at his house, on the other hand, was a perfect match. Because after his arrest, the police got a search warrant for his apartment, and what they found inside was beyond damning. Among his possessions, they discovered several items belonging to all 3 of the victims of the Naro-Fominsk Maniac, including a watch that had been taken from Olga, which still had his fingerprints on it. It would later be revealed that he'd given it to his girlfriend as a present. He had a large collection of knives, and one of them, a stiletto-like knife, was quickly determined to be a perfect match for the wounds inflicted on all 3 of the murdered women. There was now no doubt that Andrei was the serial killer they'd been hunting for nearly a year. When they went back and confronted him with all of their evidence, Andrei was no longer able to deny his involvement. So instead, he openly confessed to them. Not only did he tell them that he'd killed all 3 of the women, he also told them he'd attacked and assaulted a 4th woman who he'd let live. But according to him, he was not responsible for his actions. When asked why, his answer was simple. He'd been told to do it. He was just following orders. Orders that came from Lucifer, the devil himself. Ordinarily, claims that the devil made me do it wouldn't be taken too seriously in a situation like this, dismissed as a desperate attempt to appear insane by an obviously guilty killer. But in this instance, the detectives had to genuinely consider the possibility that Andrei was being truthful, at least in the sense that he genuinely believed to be following the devil's orders. And to understand why that is, we need to take a pause from the investigation, and we need to go all the way back to the start. Born on April 2, 1978 in Naro-Fominsk, Andrei was adopted at a young age by a wealthy family. Holding significant influence in the region, his adoptive father was an extremely successful businessman, while his adoptive mother was the director of a meat processing plant. By all accounts, Andrei had an idyllic childhood, raised under their loving care and never wanting for anything. By the time he was 20 years old, he'd secured a position as an inspector for the Russian traffic police. And at the department, he quickly gained a reputation for being diligent and disciplined, with his colleagues viewing him as so morally strong that they genuinely believed he was incorruptible and incapable of being bribed. As a result of his outstanding reputation, it didn't take him long to rise to the role of sergeant. And by the age of 23, Andrei was doing well enough to purchase his own apartment and even buy himself a brand new Audi A6. He was living a comfortable life. He was paid well, respected by his colleagues, and had a loving family supporting him. But then in 2001, he met Dmitry Korotkov and Alexei Zagriatsky at a party. And as far as anyone can tell, from that moment on, everything changed. Dmitry and Alexei were friends who'd initially met while incarcerated for vandalism. Both of them had been arrested for setting fire to apartment doors in completely separate acts of hooliganism. I assume they bonded over their bizarrely similar criminal history. I mean, what are the odds of being imprisoned with someone else who thought burning people's doors was a fun pastime? After their releases, the duo moved into a life of petty crime. But they both craved something more, something bigger. They had an acquaintance who sold stolen foreign cars for big money, the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars. So they began working on a scheme to acquire the sorts of high-value cars he wanted. The only problem was they couldn't figure out exactly how to pull it off. But that all changed when they met Andrei and learnt that he was a traffic officer. So as the two friends chatted with him over drinks at the party, they took their chance and made a proposal to him, to use his position to help make their plan a reality and make all three of them extremely wealthy. But Andrei was already wealthy. Not only was his job highly paid, but he grew up in an extremely privileged household, and according to all his police colleagues, he was morally incorruptible, so you'd assume Andrei would have turned the two criminals down. But he didn't. Seemingly, Andrei liked their idea, and for reasons nobody but him will ever truly understand, he jumped headfirst into the scheme with them. Before long, the three of them began actively preparing to carry out their first robbery. But first, they needed to acquire a firearm. After failing to purchase one from military personnel posted near Naro-Fominsk, they turned their attention to a criminal gang near Moscow instead. They arranged to meet up with members of the gang in Obninsk to purchase firearms from them. But when they met up with the hardened gangsters, they took their money and gave them nothing in return. Essentially, these real, actual criminals saw straight through the trio of amateurs and robbed them of everything they had on them. When the three of them tried to protest, the gang members turned violent and threatened to kill them if they ever saw them again. This encounter spooked the three men so much that they completely pivoted from their original plan and made acquiring guns their number one priority, believing they needed them to protect themselves from the violent gang who'd threatened them. So they altered their scheme, deciding to focus on stealing less valuable cars they could dismantle to sell off the parts and raise the money they needed. After days of reconnaissance, they selected a stretch of the Borovsko highway between two villages to carry out their plan. They armed themselves with a guitar string fashioned into a noose with wooden tips, a knife, a police baton, and Andrei's traffic police inspector uniform, and waited. As dusk settled, Andrei walked along the side of the highway in his uniform, swinging his baton, waiting for the perfect target to appear. It was Denis Yeltsov, the driver of a brand new Audi A6, who fell into the trap, stopping at an intersection in what he believed was an official traffic stop. With Dmitry and Alexei pretending to be policemen behind him, Andrei accused Denis of drunk driving and told him they would have to take him to the local town of Upperlevka for examination. Thinking he was obeying law officials, Denis did what he was told, moving over to the passenger seat to let Andrei get into the driver's seat, with one of his accomplices getting in the back of the car. Suddenly, the guitar string was hooked around Denis's neck. But as Denis fought back, refusing to stay still, Andrei pulled out his knife and began stabbing him over and over. Somehow, Denis was able to force his way out of the car. He fell onto the road where he was almost struck by another vehicle. Panicked, Andrei and whichever of the two accomplices was in the car with him both jumped out and rushed to their own vehicle, speeding off. The motorist helped Denis, calling for an ambulance and the police. He miraculously survived the attack and told the police that it was one of their own officers who had tried to kill him. Despite their meticulous planning, the amateur criminals had made an obvious and massive mistake. They'd used Andrei's own car for the crime and hadn't even bothered to alter the license plates. So within mere hours of the attack, the police found and arrested all three of them. The trio were charged with a wide range of crimes, including robbery, attempted murder, and forming a criminal group. The case even received widespread coverage in the media, leading the police to issue warnings for drivers only to stop at official checkpoints manned by legitimate traffic officers. Nobody was particularly surprised by the involvement of Dmitry and Alexei, but everyone struggled to understand why and how Andrei, who was given the name Sergei Golikov in the press to protect his identity, was involved in the vicious attack. As far as anyone could tell, he was a law-abiding moral officer of the law. Given his wealthy background, nobody could even understand his motives for involving himself in such a lazy criminal scheme. It wasn't like he needed the money, so what was he getting out of it? And why had he instantly turned to such extreme violence at the first opportunity? His superior officer at the traffic police station speculated that maybe some unknown family circumstances had forced his hand. But if that was the case, whatever it was never came to light. And things only got weirder from there. Because while he was awaiting trial, Andrei began making strange statements about Satanism and the occult, some of which were quite extreme and alarming, such as claiming he wanted to own a wallet crafted from human skin. As his statements got increasingly disturbing, he was sent for psychiatric evaluation. And while Dmitry and Alexei were deemed mentally fit, found guilty in court, and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, Andrei wasn't. Instead, he was deemed unfit to stand trial, and he was committed to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. Although it's never been substantiated, there was a prevailing belief in the Russian media that Andrei's influential adoptive father had played a role in helping him to evade imprisonment, either through bribery or by paying for experts to help him present himself as legally insane. After supposedly being cured, Andrei was released from the psychiatric ward a few years later and returned to his hometown of Naro-Fominsk. But supposedly, the strange ritualistic beliefs that had gotten him institutionalized in the first place had only grown stronger in the years he was locked up, at least if his version of events are to be believed, because once he was back in his hometown, he instantly began devouring literature about Satanism, voodoo rituals, and the occult, obsessively learning everything he could about the topics. The few friends he had claimed that it was all he spoke about when they tried to interact with him. This obsession soon manifested into rituals that involved stabbing dolls, and it wasn't long before he began fantasizing about doing the same thing to living women with his growing collection of knives. Then on May 18, 2008, his desires became so insurmountable that he decided to act on them, and he attacked Maria Veselova as she walked back to her family's dacha. All three of Andrei's victims were young women attacked in the daylight. All of them were choked with rope before being fatally stabbed with his stiletto knife. He then stole various personal belongings from them, but not any money, which is why police didn't notice at first. And as an attempt at a macabre calling card, he then left behind a personal item belonging to each previous victim at the next crime scene. He presumably would have continued doing this had he not been caught, ironically due to a badly planned, botched robbery, just like when he was first arrested. After being officially charged with 3 counts of murder, Andrei was sent to the Serbsky Center in Moscow for psychiatric evaluation. The team there examined him and diagnosed him with schizophrenia, noting that he suffered from a progressive personality disorder and displayed signs of extreme aggression. As a result, their conclusion was clear: he should not be held criminally liable. The case went to court in 2010, where it was down to the judge to decide if the legal system agreed with the medical findings that Andrei could not be held accountable for his crimes. In the glass dock, Andrei sat in a winter jacket and a dark blue hat that concealed his face. He kept his head down and remained largely silent through the sessions, seeming disinterested with it all. The only times he did speak, he muttered about the devil and ranted about how much he hated the church. When the prosecutor asked if he'd committed the acts in the indictment, he didn't deny his guilt at all and answered simply yes, before continuing to ramble about how Lucifer had instructed him to commit the crimes. His lawyer told the court, "All 4 doctors at the Serbsky All-Russian Research Institute who assessed Surikov believe he is extremely aggressive, cruel, impulsive, and exhibits persistent delusional behavior. They even claimed that his illness had started to worsen after his previous treatment was stopped, blaming the state for releasing and abandoning him when he clearly needed their help." In contrast, the prosecution was adamant that Andrei was not mentally ill and was fit to stand trial. They argued that his rants about the devil were not a sign of his delusions, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan to present himself as mentally ill and avoid being imprisoned, just like last time. They had multiple witnesses testify against him, including his ex-girlfriend. She told the court that he'd asked her to provide him with an alibi, urging her to tell the police he'd been with her at the time of the 3 murders. Olga's mother, Nina Mikhalina, also reminded the court that Andrei had made a conscious effort to conceal evidence and hide the bodies, such as hiding her daughter's body in a bathroom. These sorts of behaviours, the prosecution argued, made it clear that Andrei knew that what he was doing was wrong, not only at the time of the murders, but in the aftermath of them too. Nina and the other family members of the victims contested the Serbsky Center's insanity ruling, all believing that Andrei was a master manipulator trying to avoid punishment and imprisonment, and as a result they asked for new evaluations to be done. Marina's husband, Alexei, later said, "I wasn't convinced by the findings of the forensic examination. We believe he's attempting to evade accountability." However, the judge dismissed their request for a new medical evaluation to be done. He claimed the first report was valid, done by the country's top experts, and there was no reason to assume a second report would reach a different conclusion. Ultimately, none of the family members chose to appeal the judge's decision. In February 2010, the Moscow Regional Court ruled that Andrei was not criminally responsible and ordered him to receive compulsory treatment in a psychiatric hospital instead of imprisonment for his crimes. The judge noted that Andrei was a special danger to society, and when asked if he had anything to say about the decision, Andrei simply shook his head and remained silent. It's a little unclear exactly what happened to Andrei after the ruling. Some reports claim that he remains incarcerated to this day. Others, including a 2012 Russian documentary titled The Station Strangler, claim that he took his own life shortly after being sent to the psychiatric hospital. And while I know that's a frustratingly ambiguous ending to the story, there unfortunately just doesn't seem to be enough information out there about the case to verify what truly happened to him. But either way, there are still huge questions surrounding this case. For one, why did this seemingly upstanding police officer give everything up for a life of crime? It almost feels like Andrei switched overnight from apparent normality and morality to extreme violence and cruelty. Was it really because he believed he was receiving orders from the devil, telling him to commit brutal murders? Or was this simply a case of a privileged psychopath who had everything, committing violence and murder for nothing more than the thrill of it? Who then used his father's connections and his own clever manipulation to trick the Russian courts into absolving him of responsibility? I have to assume there are huge gaps in the limited reporting of the crime that goes some way to explaining how it all makes sense. Because from the outside looking in, it does feel like the entire devil made me do it angle was just a scheme for him to avoid being held accountable for his actions. But if that was the case, then what actually motivated him to commit the murders? It sort of makes more sense if the satanic claims are actually true, because if he really was schizophrenic and delusional, at least I could understand why his behavior seemed so all over the place, and why he was able to seemingly turn into someone else entirely so suddenly and so drastically. The act of leaving previous victims' belongings at his new murder scenes is particularly interesting to me. It seems to generally be viewed as his calling card, but that implies that he wanted people to know the murders were the acts of one individual, a serial killer. While that's probably true, if we do accept that Andrei really did believe he was under orders from Satan, could it actually be part of some sort of ritual he thought he was carrying out? As I said, there's a lot of unanswered questions in this case, and even when it comes to Russian sources, there just doesn't seem to be enough information out there to make sense of it all. Assuming that he's still alive, Andrei would be 47 years old today. So unfortunately, with that open-ended conclusion, our exploration of Russia's Naro-Fominsk maniac comes to a close. Let me know what you make of it all, as I really can't figure out the truth of it from the available facts and reports. As always, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and do all those sorts of things that the algorithm gods need to judge the video as worthy of their attention. If you like the content I make and you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked below as well. I can't really offer much in the way of perks right now, but if you do join, you get your name featured at the end of my videos as a little thank you. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. July 2nd, 2008. Early in the morning, the sun has barely risen over the small city of Rio Brilhante in Brazil. The streets are still empty, save for a few early risers starting their day. One such early riser walks along a narrow road in the city centre when he glances into a nearby vacant lot and sees something strange among scattered rubbish and weeds. Lying motionless in the dirt is the body of a man. His arms are stretched out wide, his legs crossed neatly at the ankles. The shape is unmistakable, a crucifixion. Shirtless, the letters INRI have been crudely carved into the man's flesh, just above his sternum, a Latin acronym meaning Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Whatever had happened here, it clearly wasn't random. This wasn't some street robbery gone wrong. This was something else entirely. Police arrive quickly at the scene as a crowd begins to gather, including journalists from the town's local newspapers and TV stations. Because in a city of less than 40,000 people, this sort of thing just didn't happen. It doesn't take long for the body to be identified as 33-year-old bricklayer Catalino Gardina. Examining his body, police determined that he had been suffocated with a plastic bag and stabbed once in the heart with a knife, possibly the same one used to carve the letters into his chest. The deliberate staging of the body makes it clear that this is not a typical murder scene. It feels ritualistic, sacrificial even. But beyond these disturbing signs, there's little forensic evidence at the scene. There's no obvious murder weapon that's been left, no fingerprints are found, no clear footprints are discovered, and they can't even determine if Catalino was killed there or brought there afterwards by his killer. All they can say for certain is that his killer had very purposefully and very deliberately posed his body in the shape of a cross. But whether it was intended to mean something religious, something ritualistic, or something else entirely is unclear. So police begin canvassing the area, as well as Catalino's neighbours, looking for anyone who might have heard or seen something suspicious the night before. But nobody had. As they dig into Catalino's background, they find little that could point to a motive. He was a quiet man, described as humble by his friends and family. He was openly gay, and he was said to have struggled with alcoholism and even drug abuse in the past. And while nobody knows it at the time, these particular traits would be vital to understanding why he was attacked and what had happened to him that night. So with no leads at all and no answers from the police, the media begins to fill the vacuum with speculation. While some newspapers and TV reports feature concerned locals describing how they're too afraid to leave their homes after dark, others begin to speculate about the meaning behind the symbolic pose in writing, hinting at the possibility of something darker at work. A religious fanatic, a satanic cult, or even something supernatural. And with every headline, the fear and panic in the small city only intensifies. While the police try to downplay it to keep the public calm, even they begin to suspect that this is not going to be an isolated incident. It feels purposeful to them, the work of somebody extremely disturbed, and they can't help but wonder if Catalino's murder might just be the start of something, rather than the end. And they were right, at least about that aspect, because Catalino was the first victim of a ritualistic serial killer, and it wouldn't be long before more bodies would be found in the quiet city of Rio Brillante, each carefully positioned in the shape of a cross. And yet, even as panic spread and rumours of a serial killer took hold, no one could have imagined the truth. That behind it all was a 16-year-old boy. Driven by a twisted sense of morality, determined to purify the town by hunting those he deemed immoral, he would soon come to be known as Maniac de Cruz, or in English, the Cross Maniac. Before we carry on with the video, I just wanted to flag up front that this case has received little attention outside of Brazil, and as a result, many of the sources used to write this script have been translated into English, which could lead to some details being incorrect or lost in translation. I've done my best to verify everything, but it just feels inevitable in these sorts of scenarios that I'll make some mistakes. I just thought it was worth saying before we jump back into the case. The following month, on August 24th, a second body was found in Rio Brillante. This time, a woman was discovered lying on her back on top of a grave in the São Cristóvão cemetery. Just like Catalino, her arms were fully extended to either side, with her palms facing upwards and her legs crossed at the ankles, making the recognizable crucifixion pose. She was completely naked, and her neck bore clear signs of pressure, bruising, redness, and swelling, indicating she had likely been strangled. She was quickly identified as 22-year-old Leticia Neves de Oliveira, a gas station attendant who had failed to return home after finishing her shift the previous evening. Tragically, her family had reported her missing just hours before her body was discovered. Just like with Catalino's crime scene, the investigators found no signs indicating a struggle had occurred in the area. So this meant that not only had her body been placed there with caution, but that her killer had been extremely careful and precise when arranging her limbs into the cross pose. Leticia didn't even appear to have any defensive wounds visible, leading them to suspect she was either taken by surprise or had been unconscious when she was killed. There was nothing carved into her skin, like there had been with Catalino, though several sources claim a small cross necklace was placed around her neck, but I couldn't verify that detail. Despite being found naked, tests showed no evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. Her friends and co-workers told the police she had no known enemies. She was quiet and hard-working, lived with her family, and had no criminal record. Unlike Catalino, she didn't use drugs, and she wasn't a heavy drinker, and as far as they could tell, she had no other connection with him. But they knew there had to be a reason the killer had chosen these two individuals. Nobody would create such carefully staged scenes using random victims. Would they? Interestingly, they did discover that Leticia was also gay. Given the religious symbolism, this led to speculation that, perhaps rather than a cult or satanic motive as initially theorized, their suspect could be motivated by religion, murdering those he saw as morally flawed and sinful. Even though the locals immediately linked the two cases for obvious reasons, the police refused to publicly confirm any connection between them, wanting to prevent mass panic. Despite their attempts to maintain calm and order, with this second victim found posed in the shape of a cross, it wasn't just local news who began covering the case, it became a national story. And as mass panic and fear overtook Brazil, that's when the nickname began to take hold: the Maniac of the Cross. People were so afraid that nighttime curfews were followed by just about everyone in the city, despite not being legally enforced. Local downtown shops were reported to be practically empty after dark, and that was if they stayed open at all. Some schools even shortened their hours so kids could get home earlier, especially after a large number of parents began refusing to let their children walk home alone, regardless of the time of day. Some local religious leaders also began using the cases as fuel for their sermons, preaching about morality and punishment, further fanning the flames of paranoia in the largely religious community, whether intentionally or not. And then a third body was found, and this time the victim was a child. On October 3rd, 13-year-old Gleice Kelly da Silva left her school and never made it home. She was last seen walking alone in a quiet residential area of Rio Brilhante, wearing her school uniform and carrying a small shoulder bag. By the evening, with no sign of her, her family reported her missing to the police. Their friends and neighbours helped search for her, combing the streets, knocking on doors, and calling out her name. Because of the two recent murders, everyone feared the worst, but no one wanted to believe it could happen again, not to a child. But tragically, 2 days later, their worst fears were confirmed. In an unfinished, half-abandoned construction site on the outskirts of town, Gleice's body was discovered. She was lying on her back, stretched out across a slab of concrete surrounded by broken beams and discarded bricks. Once again, she had been posed like a cross, with her arms extended fully to either side and her legs crossed precisely at the ankles. But this time, the killer had left something else at the scene: a message. Beside her body, police discovered a handwritten note, which reportedly read "Corpse of Thor" in English, alongside the phrase "until next hell," or potentially "until next winter." Strangely, almost every article or source I looked at had a different explanation of the contents of this note, some featuring completely new elements and others featuring differing combinations. For example, some accounts claim the note was covered in hand-drawn crosses and random letters that seemed to spell out the word hell in places. So while I can confirm there was a note, its exact contents are a little unclear. Like the first two victims, Gleice's cause of death was found to be asphyxiation, likely by strangulation. Once again, there was no sign of sexual assault, she had no defensive wounds on her body, and the crime scene offered no real forensic evidence. And like the other two cases, there were no witnesses, and there was no surveillance footage. It now seemed glaringly obvious that the killer was selecting his crime scenes carefully. They were all quiet, open-air locations, with few natural observers. Any attempts to suppress rumours of a serial killer or satanic cult now fell on deaf ears. The story had already put fear into the hearts of the nation, especially the residents of Rio Brilhante. But with the third victim being a 13-year-old child, this was ramped up to 11. Rumours about satanic rituals, religious fanatics, and supernatural curses spread like wildfire. Residents gathered in churches to pray, light candles, and plead for protection. With mounting pressure to find the killer, a special task force was formed to handle the case, pulling in resources from Campo Grande and other nearby jurisdictions. While the authorities had thought they might be onto something with their theory that the killer was a religious fanatic of some kind, punishing those he judged as morally lacking, they struggled to understand how 13-year-old Gleice could fit into this pattern. The only connection between the first two victims was that they were both gay, so they had speculated, given the religious imagery, that the killer was targeting and punishing people he believed were sinful. But this idea seemed to fall apart with the murder of Gleice. Whatever the motive, the cross maniac had made his boldest move yet, and by taking the life of a child, he had confirmed what many in Rio Brilhante had feared from the beginning. This wasn't a spree, it wasn't impulsive, it was purposeful, ritualistic, and likely going to keep happening until the person responsible was stopped. When police finally admitted that the three cases were connected and that they were hunting a serial killer, something unexpected happened. A witness came forward. A 17-year-old girl known only as Carla walked into a police station and told them that something terrifying had happened to her around a week before Gleiss was murdered. She told them she had gone to a concert in town that night. Afterwards, she was waiting near a phone booth for a relative to pick her up when a man in a hoodie approached her. Although he initially didn't say anything, he suddenly pulled out a knife and pressed it against her stomach. He then ordered her to walk with him, leading her to an abandoned building on the edge of town, and once alone, he began to interrogate her. He asked her if she believed in God, if she was a virgin, if she liked men or women, how many boyfriends she'd had, and then, perhaps most chillingly, he asked her if she thought someone could ever love him. She replied carefully and kindly, trying not to provoke him. He then told her, "I went out tonight to kill a whore, and found you instead." And then he let her go, but not before warning her that if she told anyone about what happened, he would come back to kill not only her, but her entire family too. But after seeing a 13-year-old girl had been the next victim, she felt she had no choice but to come forward, in case her attacker was the serial killer they were hunting, and her account could somehow help catch him. However, she never actually saw the man's face, at least not clearly. It was too dark and he never removed his hood, so all she could say for certain was that he sounded like he was a teenager, likely somewhere between 17 and 20. So even though her account perhaps helped them understand how the cross maniac was selecting his victims, judging them based on their answers to his questions, it didn't bring them any closer to identifying who he was. Friends, family and neighbours of Gleiss posted tributes online, many of them on occult, a social media site popular in Brazil at the time. On occult, users had what was called a scrapbook, a sort of public wall similar to a Facebook wall back then, where other people could leave public messages referred to as scraps. The task force monitored all the activity on Gleiss's page, hoping to spot something unusual or suspicious. And that's when they saw a strange message posted beneath one of the tributes on her scrapbook. Written in all capitals, it read, "Dead people don't get scraps, you sickos." The comment was clearly mocking the act of leaving tributes on the dead child's page. And while it could have been the cruel act of some internet troll, it wasn't. The message had been made by a user calling themselves DogHell666. The occult profile featured images of disturbing drawings, alongside a teenager dressed all in black, with dark eyeliner and painted nails. In a large portion of the photos, he was posing among various gravestones in the dark. The user had joined a range of troubling groups with names such as I Love Corpses and I'm a Satanist. But in reality, he in no way resembled the profile they had for their killer, who they believed to be experienced, precise, and methodical, not an attention-seeking kid. But when the records from Gleiss's phone came back, they revealed she had missed around a dozen calls right after her estimated time of death. And although the number was not directly tied to anyone, the exact same number was publicly listed in the bio of the DogHell profile as belonging to them. Whoever owned that page, whoever the teenage boy in the pictures was now seen as their prime suspect. And it didn't take long for the task force to trace the page's owner to a 16-year-old boy who not only lived in Rio Brilhante, but he was actually the neighbour of the first victim, Catalino Gardena. In fact, they had even spoken to him as a potential witness the day after Catalino's body was found, asking if he or his mother had seen or heard anything unusual. His name was Dyonathan Celestrino, and despite being only 16 years old, he was the serial killer they had been hunting. Born on January 5, 1992 in Rio Brilhante, Dyonathan was raised by his mother, who was a public school teacher, and his aunt. There doesn't appear to be any information on who his father was, or if Dyonathan himself even knew his identity. Although he grew up with little money, by all available accounts his upbringing didn't involve any obvious trauma. There were no records of abuse, no known violent incidents, and he had no criminal history. At school his teachers described him as quiet and withdrawn, but not disruptive or problematic. He wasn't bullied or tormented by his peers, though he didn't have many friends either, choosing to keep mostly to himself. As a teenager, his interests began to stand out. He dressed entirely black, wore heavy makeup, and listened to metal music. In such a small religious community, he was seen as an outsider, but nobody believed him to be dangerous. That said, he did have a difficult personality and was viewed as being unpredictable. He was known to be moody and to snap at people over the tiniest of things, such as asking him a basic question. Eerily, one of his favourite things to do was to hang out in local cemeteries by himself. And even when the killings began, he continued going out late at night and aimlessly wandering through these graveyards. His mother didn't suspect a thing, and never once asked where he was going. With no real friends, he spent hours locked in his bedroom, on the internet, particularly on occult, where he frequently posted in dark and disturbing communities about death, Satanism, and the occult. His mother wasn't allowed to enter his bedroom and had no idea what dark secrets he was hiding inside. But on October 9th, less than a week after Gleiss's body had been discovered, police arrived at his home with a search warrant. He was arrested and taken into custody without resistance, remaining completely silent when officers read him his rights. With Dyonathan out of the way, for the first time ever, his bedroom door was open to somebody other than himself. Inside, the officers were immediately struck by an imposing image on the wall, a large photograph of a man they all instantly knew and recognized, Francisco de Assis Pereira. Better known as the Park Maniac, Pereira was one of Brazil's most infamous serial killers, having assaulted and murdered at least 11 women in São Paulo in the late 1990s. His crimes were brutal, methodical, and carried out under the pretense of religious and moral authority. For most, he was a figure of horror, but in Dyonathan's bedroom, he was pinned up on the wall the way a teenager would typically place a poster of their favorite actor or musician. There were scribbled note pages everywhere, featuring satanic poetry and occult writings. One note even had a list of names, with either the word dead or saved written next to each of them. They located dozens of newspaper clippings about the cross maniac in the room, and they shockingly even found several knives, which still had traces of blood on them. And as if all of that wasn't damning enough, they found items stolen from the 3 victims scattered around the room, including jewellery that belonged to Leticia and the blouse Gleiss had been wearing when she was killed. There was now no question at all that this 16-year-old boy was the cross maniac. But what they didn't yet understand was why he had committed the murders and what the meaning of the symbolic crucifixion pose was to him. Once in custody, it didn't take long for Dyonathan to confess. He told the detectives that he did not believe in God, but that he did believe in Satan, which doesn't really make an awful lot of sense, as they're sort of a package deal. You could argue he was an atheistic Satanist, but that doesn't actually line up with his other statements either. He said that he forced his victims to go with him to isolated locations at knife point, where he would ask them a number of questions, deciding their fate based on the answers they gave him. If he deemed them to be impure in his eyes, he would kill them. But really, when it came down to it, his main explanation for why he killed all 3 of his victims was the same. He claimed they were all homosexual. This was true of Catalino and Leticia, though it's unclear if it was true of 13-year-old Gleiss. Supposedly, the crucifixion pose was to help their souls ascend into heaven, as if he was redeeming them somehow by murdering them and posing their bodies. Though if he didn't believe in God, I don't really understand how he could believe in heaven. With so much contradiction and confusion in his statements, it's difficult to make sense of what actually motivated his actions, especially given that he also confessed that he was obsessed with the Park Maniac and that one of his main goals had been to surpass his idol's body count. He told them he looked up to Pereira, that he'd studied his case and all of his murders, and in doing so he made it very clear that he hadn't acted impulsively. He had been careful, precise, methodical, and that's what made him even more dangerous, because this wasn't about rage, it was about control. He believed he was right, and worse, he believed he was necessary. In his eyes, his murders were moral and justified. He was punishing people who were impure. That same day, a press conference was held announcing the apprehension of the cross maniac. The revelation that a 16-year-old teenager was behind the murders shocked not just the residents of the city of Rio Brilhante, but the entire nation of Brazil. Despite the damning evidence, it just didn't seem believable to many of the locals, and so there was immediate speculation that Dyonathan had not acted alone. The belief that he had been leading a cult of satanic teenagers became widespread, so much so that the police had to formally declare that he had acted entirely alone. Though this did little to stop the whispers of a murderous cult still lurking in the shadows, who were even more dangerous now their head had been severed. Psychiatric evaluations of Dyonathan determined that he was mentally competent, even though he displayed a number of disturbing traits. He was emotionally cold, unpredictable, and showed no signs of empathy or remorse. As a result, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and chronic psychopathy. One of the psychologists even claimed that his religious motive was completely made up, and that he actually killed because he enjoyed the sense of control and power he felt from making other people suffer. In their final report, the evaluators stated that Dyonathan presented a high risk of future violence and posed an ongoing danger to society. But because he was still a minor, Brazilian law significantly limited his potential punishment. No matter how horrific his crimes were, he could only be held until he was 21 under the Child and Adolescent Statute. which meant that he could only receive a 5-year sentence for the murders of 3 people. Although the authorities tried to have him institutionalized as a way to get around this limitation, every psychiatric hospital they spoke to refused to accept him as a patient. So he was sent to a juvenile correctional facility in Ponta, nearly 200 kilometers from his hometown, to be held until he turned 21. There he kept mostly to himself, with staff finding him polite and respectful. They reported that he got good grades in his classes and even turned in some of the best assignments in his group. But in 2013, he turned 21. And as a result, his sentence was officially over, which meant legally there were no grounds to keep him detained, and he had to be released back into the world. But the deadline for his release came and passed and nothing changed, with authorities keeping Dyonathan behind bars. Despite his apparent good behavior throughout his time in prison, continuous psychiatric evaluations classified him as psychologically unstable, manipulative, and unrepentant. They all made it clear he continued to pose a threat to the public and was extremely likely to reoffend and even murder again if he was let free. Though no official new sentence was given to him, a judge decided that he posed too great a risk to be released, and as a result, he would remain behind bars. There was no set release date and no planned end to his incarceration, so in essence, he was going to remain in prison indefinitely. As you can probably imagine, Dyonathan wasn't too happy with this ruling. He believed he'd served his time and that legally he should be set free. So he took matters into his own hands. Although there were plans to move him to a more secure facility, Dyonathan was still being held in the Ponta Juvenile Center, and it was significantly lacking in security measures. Taking advantage of this, Dyonathan somehow got hold of a saw of some kind, though the details are a little unclear. He may have had it smuggled into the prison, or perhaps fashioned it out of materials he acquired somehow. He then used it to quietly cut through the metal bars over the window in his room, allowing him to slip through it and escape on March 3, 2013. No guards saw him go. There were no alarms, no chase. By the time anyone even noticed he was missing, he was already long gone. The next morning, the news that the cross maniac had escaped spread fast, with national media outlets running the story within hours, and the public being immediately put on alert. His images were plastered all over the news, with the public being asked to report any potential sightings of him. Tip lines were instantly flooded with calls, with people claiming to see him all around the country as mass panic overtook Brazil. There was still a genuine belief that Dyonathan was the leader of some sort of satanic cult, and that he was going to reunite with them now that he was out, and not only continue his murder spree, but escalate it to make up for lost time. A number of social media profiles appeared online, which claimed to be Dyonathan himself, featuring posts where he threatened to kill again, this time in different cities across the country. Although all these profiles were later found to be fake by the police, the impact they had on the public was very real. The detention center he escaped from wasn't far from the border of Paraguay, so Brazilian police reached out to their Paraguayan counterparts, telling them there was a high chance a dangerous serial killer had crossed the border into their country. And they were totally right, because on April 27th, almost 2 months since his escape, a Brazilian expat in the Paraguayan city of Horqueta informed the police that he had seen Dyonathan on the street, recognizing his face. Following up on his tip, Dyonathan was discovered to be living in a nearby boarding house. There, he had been leading a surprisingly low-key life, working at a car wash, learning to speak Spanish, and even dating a local woman. But inside his room, police allegedly found notebooks filled with disturbing drawings and chilling phrases such as, "All Catholics must die," and "Alive or dead, I'm a serial killer." There are even claims that his phone contained messages showing he'd been planning to meet up with a 14-year-old boy the week he was arrested, implying he had intended to murder him. Whether he killed anyone else during his 2 months of freedom is unknown. Though if he did, he clearly didn't pose them in the same crucifixion style he had become notorious for, otherwise I imagine it would have been all over the news. After his discovery, he was arrested and taken into custody by Paraguayan police, where he instantly confessed that he was the notorious maniac of the cross. They discovered that his room in the boarding house had been paid for by his mother and his aunt, and that they had regularly visited him there, meaning they had been knowingly aiding a violent fugitive. I would have thought that would be enough for them to be legally punished in some manner themselves, but I couldn't find anything claiming that was the case. Dyonathan even gave an interview on a local radio station after his arrest, where he claimed that he was actually a hitman and not a serial killer, despite the claim contradicting all the evidence and his own prior confessions. Regardless, 2 days after his arrest, on April 29th, he was extradited back to Brazil. The cross maniac was back in their custody, but the question of what exactly they were meant to do with him still remained unanswered. While authorities tried to figure out what to do with him, with more than 20 psychiatric facilities refusing to admit him as a patient, he was almost killed in custody when a police officer fired a shot at him in his cell, grazing his face. The officer later claimed his gun had fired by accident, but other witnesses claimed he had been threatening Dyonathan for days and had pointed his gun at him multiple times. Eventually, he was admitted to the psychiatric wing of the Campo Grande Penal Institution, a secure unit in a maximum security prison where he could receive treatment for his mental illnesses. However, he didn't fade quietly back into the prison system. While he was previously seen as a model inmate, after being recaptured, his imprisonment was marked by repeated violence, erratic behavior, and clashes with prison staff and other inmates. For example, in 2015, he attacked a prison guard with a sharpened broomstick, and the following year he tried to stab another staff member with a fork. In one of the most serious incidents, in September 2023, he assaulted a prison officer, punching him in the face and threatening to kill him, all because he didn't want to go back to his cell following his recreational time. Even when he was restricted to only having solitary yard time, he continued to cause trouble. In October, he threw a bottle of urine at a guard, something reports claim he had done multiple times, after once again being asked to return to his cell. As a result of all this, he is never left unsupervised in any situation, and is seen as a serious risk to those inside the prison, let alone the public outside. In 2024, Brazil's custodial hospitals were all ordered to be closed, meaning there would no longer be any form of psychiatric detention available in the country. These institutions were realistically the only places equipped to manage mentally ill offenders like Dyonathan. With their closures, he was moved out of psychiatric care and into a secure wing of the prison with the general population. Now in his mid-30s, Dyonathan remains behind bars, spending most of his time in isolation for the safety of the staff and the other inmates. And there are no signs that his mental illness, or his violent behavior, have improved. Interestingly, his detention has never actually been legally defined. There has been no trial, no sentence, and there is no clear legal path forward. So while he could technically remain incarcerated until the day he dies, he could also technically be released at any point if a judge ordered him to be. And that's where the case sits today, with Dyonathan in a sort of legal limbo inside a locked cell in a maximum security prison, with no sentence and no end date, just a locked door, and the uneasy hope from the residents of Rio Brilhante that it stays shut. And with that, our exploration of Brazil's cross-maniac killer comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and comment and all that sort of stuff that helps feed the appetite of the ever-hungry algorithm gods, so other people actually get a chance to watch the video, or the chance to ignore it. Either way, all that sort of stuff helps put it in front of people, so it gets the opportunity to live or die on its own 2 feet. As I said up front, a lot of the information about this case hasn't come from English language sources, so there's a high likelihood that some of the details will be wrong or mistranslated, but I've tried my best to be as accurate as possible with the information presented. If any of you happen to be Brazilian and know more about the case or want to correct anything I've said, then just let me know down below. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and checking out some of my other true crime content. If you want to support my channel further and to have your name at the end of my videos, I've got a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon in the description too. Until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. September 3rd, 1986. After spending an evening testing out a couple of rifles with their friends, Doug and Chris Wells arrive back at their house on Parker Court in Missoula, Montana. But as they approach, they notice an orange and white Ford pickup parked awkwardly across their front lawn, half on the street, half on the grass. Grabbing a flashlight, Doug shines it into the truck, spotting a man slumped over the driver's seat who seems to shift slightly from the light, but he just looks like he's passed out. So thinking the driver probably just had too much to drink, he joins his wife in the house. As Chris gets ready for bed, Doug, a gunsmith by trade, heads down to the basement, wanting to clean up one of the old Savage model rifles he had been testing out earlier that night before he goes to sleep. Once he's finished, he leaves the gun resting on his reloading bench beside 6 untouched cartridges. But just as he's about to head upstairs to bed with Chris, he pauses. he can't shake the sense that something's off about the truck parked outside. So he heads back out, planning to take down the license plate and call the cops. But when he opens his front door, the truck has vanished. With no choice but to shrug it off, Doug suddenly remembers he hasn't taken the garbage out yet, and tomorrow is trash day. But as he pulls the bins out of his garage, something catches in the corner of his eye. Movement. A man hidden in the shadows, crouching behind an ornamental evergreen to the side of his house. Panicked, Doug calls out, asking who's there. In response, the man jumps out into the open, announcing himself as Wayne from Conlin's. Despite having met him before, Doug doesn't immediately recognize Wayne as someone who works for his wife at Conlin's Furniture. If he had, his reaction might have been very different. Because Wayne had actually been harassing his wife for months at this point, having become disturbingly obsessed with her. Instead, Doug questions what the hell he's doing in the bushes, and when Wayne tells him that he'd seen somebody out here acting strangely, Doug's mind immediately thinks of the suspicious truck from earlier, instead of how suspicious Wayne's presence at his house is. Assuming he must have been driving by and seen something, when Wayne tells him to hurry inside and grab a flashlight so they can check it out together, Doug doesn't think twice about it. But as Doug steps into his garage and heads up the stairs to his house, something suddenly strikes him hard. Doug collapses into his living room, blood pouring from a deep wound in the back of his head. As he turns himself over, he sees Wayne moving up the steps towards him, his eyes cold and empty, holding a heavy-looking black baton. His instincts taking over, Doug manages to boot Wayne in the leg hard enough that he stumbles back into a wall before he can hit him again. And as Wayne tries to stand, Doug launches himself at him. Struggling desperately, the two men crash around the living room, knocking furniture over and slamming into walls. Hearing the commotion, Chris rushes down to see what's happening, finding her husband bleeding badly from the back of the head as he fights with the intruder. But then, Wayne suddenly pulls out a black Ruger, aiming it at Doug and ordering him to move back. Reluctantly, Doug does as he's told, releasing Wayne and shifting towards his wife, who is staring at the intruder with confusion, because she instantly recognizes him. But as she tries to reason with her employee and ask why he's doing this, Wayne waves the gun in her face, shutting her down. He tells her that he's done something really terrible and needs to get out of town. He knows Conlin's got paid today, so he's certain she has money in the house. Then, Wayne pulls out a plastic bag he's hidden beneath his shirt, removing a length of white clothesline rope from it, which he cuts with a kitchen knife from his belt. He tosses the rope over to Chris, ordering her to tie up her husband. Chris tries to assure him that it isn't necessary, but he ignores her. And with how cold and calculated he now looks, she silently accepts that she has no choice but to obey him. So she ties Doug's hands and feet, with Wayne ordering her to pull the binds tighter and tighter. She then leads him to the money they have in the house, including showing him where her purse is. All the while, she tries to question him about what it is he's supposedly done, not yet realizing the gravity of the situation she's in. She doesn't even consider the idea that Wayne might have any intention other than robbing them. Not yet anyway. After searching through the house and closing all of the blinds, Wayne then ties Chris up as well, despite Doug's protests. He tells them that he'll call someone when he's gone to come and untie them, even getting them to give him the phone number of a friend, which he writes down on a note. However, through all of this, it starts to become clear to Doug that Wayne is not in a rush as he'd claimed. He doesn't even seem panicked. He seems calm and rational, like he knows exactly what he's doing. And then Wayne tells them that he's going to separate them so they can't help untie each other when he leaves. With Doug unable to do anything, Wayne carries Chris out of the room, down the hall, and into the bedroom. There, he uses more rope to tie her wrists and ankles to the bed, stuffing a makeshift gag in her mouth. With Chris secured, he returns to Doug and stuffs a sock into his mouth. Even though Doug instantly realizes he can just spit it out, he doesn't, thinking he should play along with Wayne, who is looking more unhinged by the minute. Then, Wayne takes Doug to the basement, helping him down the stairs and over to a post he can tie him to. But as he tries to tie him up, Doug slips down to the floor, bleeding badly from his head wound and struggling to stand. In anger, Wayne hits him with the baton, over and over again. Doug manages to scramble back, pleading with him to leave now he has the money, but instead, Wayne pulls his gun back out and tells him to move back to the post and to stay still this time, or he'll shoot him. Finally realizing that both he and Chris are in real danger, Doug has no choice but to let Wayne loop rope around his neck, armpits and shoulders, anchoring him to the post. When he's done, he heads up the stairs and slams the door shut behind him. And alone in the room, Doug's eyes immediately shift to the old rifle resting on his reloading bench. Upstairs, Chris tries desperately to loosen her binds, making slow but steady progress, knowing that she could get to the phone and call for help if she could just undo them. But before she gets a chance, Wayne returns, and without saying a word, he circles around her like a predator studying its prey. Confident her binds are still in place, he leaves the room again, returning to Doug to do the same thing. He continues moving back and forth between the two rooms for half an hour, with the couple both trying to free themselves every time he leaves them alone. But Doug's consciousness is fading fast, with an enormous amount of blood spilling from his head. And when his eyes open to see Wayne yet again, he suddenly feels a sharp blow to his chest. He looks down to see a knife piercing his body. He sucks in air as Wayne withdraws the blade, casually wiping away the blood on Doug's pants. This was his plan all along, to eliminate Doug and have Chris all to himself. So he heads up the stairs for the final time, leaving Doug alone to bleed out in the basement. Slumping down, Doug can feel his life fading away. But something inside of him refuses to give up, refuses to let Wayne do the same thing to his wife. And so he somehow finds the strength to stay awake, to force himself up, and to continue working to escape his binds. Eventually, he manages to loosen the ropes around his body and neck, just enough to slip one of his hands free, and with a desperate tug, he's able to pull the last knot and move his hands away from the post. Barely able to stand, Doug staggers over to the reloading bench and grabs the old rifle, but his hands are trembling so much that he can barely hold it, let alone load one of the cartridges into the chamber. Against all odds, he manages to load the gun, clamber up the basement stairs, and emerge back in the hallway. Knowing Wayne will return if he makes any noise, he hides himself in the shadows, aims the rifle at the top of the stairs, and kicks the wall as loudly as he can. Wayne appears just as he'd expected. He begins moving down the stairs when he suddenly spots Doug in the darkness, bloody and battered, and pointing the rifle at him. Doug sees a split second of fear flash across Wayne's face before he charges towards him. But Doug does not hesitate. The bullet hits Wayne in the side, causing him to stumble before scrambling back out of sight. Doug forces himself up the stairs after him with the now unloaded rifle, where he finds Wayne on his hands and knees, trying to stand. So he strikes Wayne on the back of the head and neck with the rifle until he collapses to the floor. But Wayne is still alive, crawling forward, down the hallway. So Doug continues to whack him with the gun with everything he's got. Finally, as they reach the bedroom door, the rifle's wooden stock shatters on Wayne's head, splinters flying everywhere. Wayne then rolls onto his back, pleading desperately for him to stop as he crawls into a corner of the bedroom, just as Chris frees herself from her binds too. As Chris sees the state of her husband, she begins punching Wayne in anger and fear, getting in Doug's way. But Doug can see Wayne reaching for his own gun. So he shoves Chris back onto the bed and swings with what's left of the rifle, hitting the gun just as Wayne fires, sending the bullet into the ceiling. With Wayne continuing to pull his trigger, Doug hits him relentlessly to try and stop him, not even stopping when one of the bullets tears through his leg. The lamp beside them falls and shatters, plunging them into darkness, the only light now coming from Wayne's gunshots. But Doug knows there's a handgun in one of the bedroom drawers, so he clambers over to it in the darkness and pulls it out. He then flicks on the main light, planning to catch Wayne off guard and shoot him. But then he stops. Wayne is wheezing and his eyes are rolled back, having accidentally shot himself in the head with his own gun during the chaos. Chris kicks his gun away from his hand as Doug lies down on the bed, knowing that he's managed to save his wife, but not himself. At least that's what he thinks. But he's wrong. Despite his serious injuries, after hours on the operating table, Doug is able to pull through and make a full recovery. Wayne, on the other hand, is not so lucky. But Wayne Nance was not just any old home invader. While Doug believed he had just killed an intruder in self-defense, he had, in reality, just ended the reign of terror of one of the nation's most vicious, unknown serial killers. Because after Wayne's death, evidence found in his house and later revelations would confirm that between 1974 and 1986, he had already murdered at least 6 other people before attacking Chris and Doug that night. With his crimes only being connected to him after his death, the true number of Wayne's victims are unknown, and nowadays he is better known as Born on October 18, 1955, Wayne Nance grew up in a working-class trailer park just outside of Missoula, alongside his 4 siblings. His father, George, was a truck driver who was rarely home, and his mother, Charlene, was a part-time waitress who struggled with alcoholism. Wayne was bright and articulate, but even his mother noticed he was strange from an early age. He was obsessed with learning about adult things like sex long before he should have had any interest in the topics, and he seemed to enjoy scaring and creeping out the other children. Even as a young child, he constantly sketched creepy images of warped and distorted faces, demonic creatures, and violent, blood-drenched scenes. He was always an outsider, who didn't seem to care what anyone thought about him or how his actions impacted others. But most concerning of all, he had an extremely volatile and fractious temper. The smallest things would set him off, like a glance at him that he didn't like. and be met with physical violence, meaning he regularly got into fights with other boys. Several people reported his behavior to his parents, including the owners of the trailer park, Elmer and Marge Frame, who told them Wayne seemed to find pleasure causing harm and distress to others. But George always dismissed their worries, shrugging off his son's actions with remarks such as, "Boys will be boys," and rarely disciplining him. At one point, Elmer even witnessed Wayne approach an incinerator on the trailer park before pouring a box of kittens into it and switching it on. According to Elmer, Wayne then stood listening to the animals screaming, looking completely unfazed by it. In 1968, when Wayne was 13 years old, his father, George, was arrested for armed robbery and assault. George had held up a local store at gunpoint, tying up the assistant manager and beating him with a pistol, which led to him receiving a 5-year prison sentence. And now looking after Wayne and his 4 siblings alone, Charlene found it even more difficult to keep him in check. While she wanted to send him to a reform school, she just didn't have the money to do it. Despite his growing reputation at school for terrorizing his classmates, Wayne was still an exceptional student who impressed his teachers with his grades and academic ability. They tried to encourage his love for reading, hoping it would help move him away from his troubling behavior. But Wayne only grew increasingly odd. He made friends with other kids who were outsiders, and most people just assumed he was an eccentric weirdo, like the rest of them. But while a lot of teens at the time showed an interest in things like occultism and Satanism, Wayne was fixated on them. He read and researched everything he could and talked constantly about demons, spirits, and dark gods. Even when he began carrying knives with him to school and making claims about various disturbing things he'd done, such as torturing animals with them, most of his peers and friends still believed him to be harmless. In their eyes, it was all just talk, a character Wayne was pretending to be. That is, until one day he brought a syringe into school that he claimed he found on the street, bragging that he was going to stab someone with it. His friends assumed he was just bluffing and messing around. But then, he suddenly ran up to a random student and thrust the syringe into their leg, before laughing hysterically and running off. And by the time he was 18, something had started to change in the way he acted, and it became increasingly difficult to tell whether he was just playing a part, as everyone had always thought, or if he truly meant the things he was saying. He started confiding in his friends that a dark queen had been visiting him in his dreams and telling him that he needed to make a human sacrifice before his 19th birthday in order to obtain the title Ordained Warlock. Unable to tell if he was serious or not anymore, his friends tried to talk him out of taking his dreams literally. But Wayne refused to listen to them, telling them that he had to do what the Dark Queen demanded, or there'd be consequences, and his birthday was fast approaching, meaning he was almost out of time to complete his task. On April 11, 1974, authorities believe Wayne targeted his first known victim at the age of 18. Instead of choosing somebody random to sacrifice to his Dark Queen, he selected a victim he was familiar with, the mother of one of his schoolmates, Donna Pounds. Wayne had visited the Pounds house many times and was well acquainted with the family's routine and schedule. He also knew the family was selling their home, which meant they often left the front door unlocked for the realtor. He even knew where Donna's husband, Harvey, kept his gun. It's also worth mentioning, given Wayne's satanic beliefs, that the Pounds were an extremely religious family. They were active members of the Bethel Baptist Church, where Harvey served as a deacon. Harvey was particularly devout and was preparing to lead a new congregation, which prompted the sale of their house. He even hosted a radio show that preached against the dangers of Satanism, which he believed was on the rise. That afternoon, when Donna returned to her empty house at around 1:30 p.m., she was confronted by Wayne standing in her master bedroom, holding her husband's .22 caliber pistol, having slipped into the house through the unlocked front door. Before she could even try and plead with him, he fired a warning shot, silencing her. He then ordered her onto the bed and tied her wrists and ankles to the posts with pieces of white rope he'd brought with him in a black gym bag. He then cut away her clothes with a knife and proceeded to assault her. Afterwards, he untied her and forced her down into the basement, bringing her to a small furnace room beneath the stairs. There, he tied her back up, taped her mouth shut, and stood behind her. He then fired 5 shots into the back of her head at point-blank range. As a final act of violation, he inserted the gun inside of her, leaving it there. Then he turned off the lights, climbed the stairs, and left. When Harvey arrived home, one of his daughters was watching TV with a friend, unaware her mother's dead body was down in the basement beneath them. She told him there were ropes on the bed upstairs for some reason, which he immediately went to investigate. In the bedroom, he found the ropes as well as clear signs that something terrible had happened: Donna's ripped clothes and his empty gun holster. Trying not to panic them, he convinced his daughter and her friend to go over to her place. Once he was alone, he continued looking through the house, trying to figure out what had happened and where his wife was, both of which were answered when he entered the basement and found her dead body still on her knees by the furnace. He immediately called the police, who rushed to the scene, with detectives later stating it was one of the most vicious crimes the area had ever seen. Although the detectives tried to keep the severity of the crime hidden to avoid causing mass panic in the small, tight-knit community, rumours quickly circulated about what had happened. And one such rumour was started by Wayne himself. Because the next day at school, Wayne sat next to his close friend Bill Van Canagan on the gym bleachers and coldly told him, "It's done." Then Wayne pulled up his sleeve, revealing a crude, bloodied pentagram he had carved into his forearm. Bill knew exactly what he was referring to. He knew in that moment that Wayne had made his sacrifice to the Dark Queen and that he had murdered Donna Pounds. But he didn't know what to do with the information, especially given Wayne had started making thinly veiled threats to harm him if he told anyone. He worried that if he went to the police, Wayne would find out, and he would murder him next. Wayne, after all, knew everything about him. He was one of his closest friends, or at least he had been. So Bill chose to take his information to their school principal instead, Don Harbaugh. Although Principal Harbaugh took him seriously, he also pointed out that he had no evidence Wayne had killed Donna, and that if he was wrong, accusing him of murder on the basis of his strange behaviour would ruin his life. Ultimately, he told Bill that unless he was willing to talk to the sheriff's department himself, there wasn't much he could do to help him. Surprisingly, Bill did actually find the courage to go directly to the police. And although the information he offered them gave them nothing concrete to arrest Wayne with, it turned out they had actually already been looking in his direction. Detectives had initially suspected Harvey Pounds of killing his own wife, especially as he had no alibi, and they had learnt he had been having an inappropriate relationship with another woman, giving him a motive. However, a number of witnesses came forward saying they had seen Wayne near the Pounds house on the day of the murder, with others describing someone who matched his build, carrying a black gym bag through the field behind the house. It also turned out he had skipped school that day, and nobody knew where he had been. And finally, a blood-stained latex glove was discovered on the road towards the trailer park he lived in, which had been sent off to an FBI lab for analysis. So armed with all this information, deputies went to Wayne's home in the trailer park while he was at school, where his mother, Charlene, let them in after they showed her a search warrant. Among the searchers was Deputy Larry Weatherman, whose career would in many ways be defined by this case. He had been the one who had found the latex glove, and once inside Wayne's room in the trailer, he was determined to find its missing partner. Deputy Weatherman was shocked at how neat and orderly Wayne's room was. He didn't find the glove, but he did locate a black gym bag that matched the one witnesses had seen someone carrying. And when he opened the bag, he discovered a range of bullets and shell casings inside, some of which happened to be the same brand as the ones used in the murder. The deputies even managed to locate a pair of Wayne's underwear in one of his drawers that had a dark stain on it that looked like blood, which Charlene told them she had only just washed and wasn't able to get the discoloration out. With all this evidence, they brought Wayne in for questioning. But when they spoke to him, he was calm and articulate and answered every question with ease. He told them he had been at home working on a class project that day, that the glove had nothing to do with him, that the shell casings and bullets were just random ones he had collected. He even willingly took a polygraph test for them, which he passed with ease. And given this was the early 1970s, when polygraph tests were much more widely accepted as reliable, this seemed to suggest that Wayne was telling the truth to them. By contrast, Harvey Pounds' polygraph test came back inconclusive, muddying the water even more. But what detectives didn't know at the time was that Wayne had done his homework on polygraphs, learning exactly what they measured and how they could be deceived. This included an in-depth discussion with lawyer Ronald McDonald about them while he was considering representing Wayne, though he ultimately declined to be his lawyer, finding his presence too unsettling. When the results came back from the underwear found in Wayne's bedroom, they confirmed that the stain was human blood, but the sample had been scrubbed too well to be able to confirm who it belonged to. Similarly, none of the bullets found in the gym bag were an exact match for the ones used in the murder. So with no solid evidence connecting him to the case, they were never able to formally charge Wayne for killing Donna Pounds, and instead focused their attention on Harvey, who at the time was seen as a more viable suspect. And before long, the investigation stalled and the case began to turn cold. But Deputy Weatherman never forgot about Wayne and never stopped believing he had murdered Donna Pounds. 2 months after Donna's murder, Wayne graduated high school and joined the Navy, moving to San Diego to begin his training. And just like that, he was gone, off to see the world, and out of Missoula. He didn't even stick around to greet his father when he was released from prison. For some reason, Wayne appeared to lose all interest in Satanism and the occult around this time. His obsession, his apparent motive for needing to murder Donna, being dropped as if it had never meant anything to him, as if it was just a typical teenage phase he'd grown out of. After completing his training, Wayne became an electrician aboard the USS Robertson, where he gained a reputation as an excellent, hard-working member of the crew. But everything changed in 1976, when he received a subpoena to appear before a grand jury in Missoula. Since the murder of Donna, several more murders had occurred in the county of Missoula, with none of them being solved. And this had led to a growing paranoia that a satanic cult was operating in the area. Though this rumor likely originated with Wayne's ties to Satanism and the occult, it put immense pressure on the authorities to try to solve some of these murders. And as a result, a grand jury was assembled to review the case of Donna Pounds. In total, more than 100 witnesses were called to testify, including Bill and various friends and classmates of Wayne, who told the jury about the things Wayne had said and done both before and after Donna's murder. However, Wayne himself seemed cold and disinterested throughout proceedings, denying any involvement and answering every question put to him with ease. In the end, despite the authorities proving his school project alibi had been a lie, the grand jury, just like the original detectives, did not find enough evidence to indict him, and Wayne was sent back to San Diego. But in San Diego, back aboard the USS Robertson, something changed in Wayne. He seemed unsettled by what had happened, and his mindset was suddenly completely different. Where before his record had been spotless, over the next year he faced numerous disciplinary fines and rank reductions for being caught with various illegal substances, such as LSD, stolen property, and illegal butterfly knives. And by 1977, he had been discharged for misconduct, ending his military career at the age of 22. Forced to return to Missoula, Wayne struggled to blend back into the community, given many people still suspected him of both murdering Donna and being part of a satanic cult. This led to him briefly heading over to Seattle in 1978, where it's now believed he claimed his next victim. Because not long after Wayne arrived in the area, a 15-year-old runaway called Devonna Nelson disappeared. It's believed that Wayne likely encountered her while she was hitchhiking out of Seattle, offering her a ride. Then, near the Beavertail State Park in Missoula, he assaulted her and stabbed her to death, before discarding her body near a train track. Her body wasn't found until February 27, 1980, when the crew of a freight train stumbled across it, lying against a chain-link fence near the tracks. Having been exposed to the elements for a year and a half, her body was so decomposed it was impossible to identify her. She had no shoes or underwear, and her dress had been pulled up around her neck. At the time, she became known as Betty Beavertail, a nickname Deputy Weatherman gave her due to her proximity to the Beavertail State Park. It wasn't until 1985 that she was formally identified as the runaway girl from Seattle. Although no direct evidence has been found linking Wayne to her death, authorities strongly suspect he is responsible. But at the time, nobody knew he had even been in Seattle, and he wasn't on anyone's radar as a suspect. Then, on April 4, 1980, Wayne's mother Charlene died in a car accident. She had been working at a roadside bar called The Cabin and had gotten into an argument with her husband George, who had accused her of being drunk. After speeding off in her car, she crashed into a tree while driving along Deer Creek Road. There were no skid marks found, and no signs she attempted to brake. And as a result, authorities believed she had done it intentionally. Only a month after she was buried, George's father also passed away, leaving him a small home on Minnesota Avenue, a short walk away from the cabin. So the family, including Wayne, relocated to the house. Wayne had enrolled in courses at the University of Montana and was doing surprisingly well until his mother's death, after which he began failing all of his classes and eventually dropped out. Instead, he found work as a security guard at the cabin. And Wayne was good at the job, always ready to step in but never looking for a fight. In fact, he'd warned his fellow bouncers that he might lose control if things got physical, so he usually hung back while they did the talking. Wayne seemed to finally find his place back in society, building close friendships with other employees who knew nothing about his past, and nothing about the disturbing things he continued to do behind closed doors. Everyone at the cabin saw him as charming and kind-hearted, and he seemed to go out of his way to be helpful, doing things like scraping ice off his co-workers' windshields during winter just to be nice. He was the last person any of them would have suspected of being a violent predator. In one instance, in the summer of 1981, Wayne focused his attention on a woman called Doris Schmidt. Doris had recently moved into a one-bedroom apartment in East Missoula after separating from her husband, Bill. Having watched her since she'd moved in, Wayne knew that she lived alone and would be an easy target. But what he didn't know was that on the very night he chose to attack her, she had allowed Bill to stay over to help comfort him over his father's battle with a terminal illness. Wayne slipped into the apartment at night and crept towards the bedroom. But when he opened the door, he was confronted by an angry Bill who ordered him to get out immediately. Wayne pretended he was drunk and confused and stumbled out of the room, closing the door behind him. But Wayne didn't actually leave. Clearly deciding his next moves, Doris heard him still moving around in the next room. So this time when Bill went out to confront him, he was forced to physically throw him out of the apartment. But the next morning, Doris and Bill woke to find Wayne asleep outside their window. He told them that he'd gotten drunk and wandered into the wrong apartment, so they didn't call the police or press charges. Only years later, when Doris discovered who Wayne truly was, did she realise just how lucky she'd been that Bill had come to stay with her that night. Rather than being put off by this experience, Wayne realised that he needed to be more cautious moving forward and to be far better prepared before his next attack. Around the same time, he began working part-time at Conlin's furniture store in Missoula, working as a delivery driver, and this gave him the perfect means of scouting for victims. The job gave him direct access into people's homes as he delivered furniture to them, allowing him to see the layout of their houses and get a sense of how many people lived there. He was literally being welcomed inside by them. Everyone at Conlin's saw him as soft-spoken and polite. But underneath the politeness, Wayne was building something. He began sketching maps and floor plans of homes that he delivered to, marking down ways to get inside and ways to make a quick escape. The maps were detailed and thorough, and on April 27, 1983, that planning turned into action. That night, as soon as Janet Wicker opened the door to her townhouse at the cobblestone apartments in Hellgate Canyon, a man sprang from the shadows and grabbed her. Wayne had previously delivered furniture to her apartment, and a detailed drawing of her home would later be found among his belongings, making it safe to assume he was her attacker. When she screamed, he punched her in the face, knocking her to the floor. She continued fighting back until he pulled a knife and threatened her with it, telling her he only wanted money, just like he would later do with Chris and Doug Wells. He then demanded that she take him to the bedroom, with Janet knowing exactly what his intentions were, but unable to do anything to stop him. But just as they reached the stairs, the front door opened as her husband arrived home earlier than expected. Wayne then pushed her aside and bolted through the apartment, jumping out of the second-floor balcony window and vanishing into the night. Having not seen his face, there was little Janet could provide the police to help identify her attacker. And once again, nobody was looking at Wayne, even though his violent and predatory behaviour was escalating week by week. Interestingly, around the time Wayne started working at Conlin's, his boss, Chris Wells, discovered somebody had snuck into her house and poured blood on her wedding dress before putting it back into her cupboard. She never found out who had done it, why they had done it, or when they had done it. But given everything that unfolded later, it seems likely that Wayne was responsible, and that it was a sign of his growing obsession with her that would ultimately lead to his own death. In August of 1984, a 16-year-old runaway calling herself Robin was hitching a ride with a trucker. But after getting into an argument with him, he kicked her out of his vehicle close to the cabin bar. Unsure what to do next, she entered the bar, striking up a conversation with Wayne as he worked as a bouncer at the doors. She told him what had happened, explaining that she didn't have any money. So putting on the charming and friendly persona he had perfected, Wayne offered to buy her a drink and began chatting with her. After telling him she had nowhere to stay, Wayne invited her to crash at his place for a bit, until she figured out what she was going to do next. Feeling an instant connection with him, she happily agreed to his offer. Even his father, George, seemed to accept her in the house, offering her money to do various chores for him. Wayne's co-workers, particularly a woman called Julie Slocum, who happened to have a crush on him, all found the dynamic between the two strange. Wayne didn't usually speak much about his private life, but now he was bragging about his sex life with Robin and telling everyone how infatuated with her he was. But around a month after she'd shown up at the bar, Robin suddenly vanished. The last time anyone saw her was at a birthday party for Julie, and when Julie and Wayne's other co-workers asked about her whereabouts, Wayne simply stated, "She's gone," which they all just assumed meant the two had broken up and that Robin had moved on, hitchhiking somewhere new. Though Julie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about it all. And she was right. Robin hadn't just gotten on a bus or in a truck and left town. She was dead. Trusting Wayne completely, she had happily accepted his invitation for a walk in the woods, likely expecting a romantic outing. Instead, Wayne led her to a shallow grave near the Bonner Dam. While it's unknown exactly what happened next, what is known is that he shot her in the back of the head, then twice more in the temple. She was left face up and naked in the grave. But unlike his previous murders and attacks, Robin's death seemed to deeply affect him, and he became noticeably withdrawn and irritable afterwards. Eventually, this led to the breakdown of his friendships with the other staff at the bar, including Julie, before he quit his job altogether, going full-time at Conlin's instead. Then, on Christmas Eve 1984, a nature photographer was walking along the frozen Clark Fork River near the Bonner Dam when he saw something poking out of the frozen ground. As he approached to see what it was, he found himself looking at a decomposed human leg. Panicked, he memorized the terrain as best as he could and hurried back to his car, driving to a phone to call the sheriff's department. Larry Weatherman, who was now a captain, was among those who arrived at the crime scene. but the ground was so frozen that their shovels couldn't penetrate it to dig out the remains. Unable to make any progress, they sealed off the scene with a tent and left a propane heater running to try and warm up the grounds over the next 2 days, returning after Christmas. Finally able to excavate the remains, they quickly determined that the victim was a woman who had been shot in the head. Captain Weatherman couldn't help but think of Betty Beavertail, who hadn't yet been identified, whose body was found tangled in a chain-link fence not far from where they now were, about 4 years earlier. This second Jane Doe was given the name Debbie Deer Creek, after a creek that flowed nearby. Importantly, the medical examiner was able to recover her dental records, hoping they might help identify her, and he also determined that her hair had been dyed multiple times, most recently a reddish auburn colour. However, just like Captain Weatherman's previous murder case, the victim did not match the description of anyone reported missing from Missoula County. He submitted her details to various other law enforcement agencies around the country, and even had a reconstruction of her face made, something he had also done for Betty Beavertail. In both cases, he had found no leads. But Captain Weatherman had never forgotten about Wayne Nance. Though everyone else in his life now viewed him as a kind, considerate person, Weatherman was confident it was all an act. He had always believed Wayne had killed Donna Pounds all those years ago, and he knew Wayne was in the area again, and that both bodies had been found close to where he was living. He strongly suspected Wayne was involved in both unsolved murders, but he had no evidence to back up his gut, and no way to prove it. After seeing a story about Debbie Deer Creek on Crime Stoppers, Julie was convinced that the victim was Robin. The dyed hair, the age, the date she was believed to have been murdered, it all lined up. So she called the hotline, telling them what she knew. However, Robin was not the girl's real name, so did not help the investigation in any way. And Julie didn't mention she had been in a relationship with Wayne Nance, because while she thought Wayne had acted strangely around the time, no part of her believed he was in any way involved. After all, the Wayne she knew was warm and kind and charming. Just like Julie, Wayne's co-workers at Conlin's only ever saw this side of him, and nobody believed for a second he could be responsible for any sort of crime. So when women began filing complaints stating that Wayne had been making obscene anonymous phone calls to them after delivering furniture to their houses, they were ignored. Nobody at the store ever followed up on them, and they were dismissed as the work of a prankster. Later that year, in September 1985, the skeletal remains of another young woman were found by a bear hunter in a wooded area near Missoula, only 3 miles from where Debbie Deer Creek's body had been discovered. Found with no clothes, no ID, and no personal items of any kind, and believed to have been left there for around a year, she was dubbed Christy Crystal Creek, after another nearby creek. Her body was severely decomposed, and she had been shot twice in the head at close range, with 2 .32 caliber bullets discovered lodged in her skull. Christy was estimated to be between 18 and 35 years old, with her dental work indicating that she may have been of Asian heritage. Captain Weatherman was hopeful this might make it easier to identify her, given dental records had just helped him to identify Betty Beavertail at long last. Interestingly, it was actually the Green River Killer Task Force who helped them to identify her as Devonna Nelson, the 15-year-old runaway from Seattle, not Montana, as Weatherman had always believed. Given the task force was hunting a serial killer who had been preying on young women, mostly runaways and sex workers, since 1982, they were cross-referencing missing persons with unidentified remains across the region. Captain Weatherman had submitted dental records for Betty Beavertail to try and identify her, and the task force found them to match the records they had for Devonna, who they had initially believed may have been a victim of the Green River Killer. But while Captain Weatherman had been able to finally identify Devonna, he had no knowledge that Wayne had been in Seattle when she vanished, and her identity brought him and his team no closer to linking Wayne, or anyone else, to the 3 murders. A few months later, on December 12, 1985, the Shook family's quiet evening in their new home was interrupted by a violent knock on their door. At the time, Teresa Shook was baking cookies, and her husband Mike was relaxing on their new sofa, which had been purchased at Conlin's Furniture and delivered a couple of weeks earlier by Wayne. Before Mike and Teresa could properly react to the loud knock, their 4-year-old son Luke rushed to the door and opened it. Standing on the other side was Wayne, holding a gun and with a knife tucked into his belt. When Luke asked who he was, Wayne stared at him for a moment before responding, "I'm Conan the Barbarian." Then, without warning, he pushed the toddler aside and shut the door. He told Mike and Teresa that he wanted money, promising that they wouldn't be harmed if they complied with his demands. While it's unclear what happened next, something led Wayne to shoot Teresa in the leg, and it would later be determined he had attempted to dig the bullet out of her leg with a knife, though he had not been successful. It's unclear exactly why he did this, but it could imply he had intended for the shot to be a warning, just like in the Donna Pounds case, or that he had been trying to retrieve the evidence and cover his tracks. A struggle then broke out. during which Mike was struck in the head before being tied up, stabbed in the chest, and left to die where he fell. This was almost identical to what he would go on to do to Doug Wells, as detailed in the opening of this video. After killing Mike, Wayne forced Teresa upstairs and tied her to the bed with rope. He then assaulted her and stabbed her to death. She was left with her underwear missing and a pillow placed over her face. Throughout the ordeal, Luke hid in his room and remained too scared to move. His 7-year-old brother, Matt, slept through the entire thing, and their 2-year-old sister, Megan, was left crying in her crib next to her mother's lifeless body. Around 10 p.m, a neighbour observed a pickup truck leaving the Shook home, one that happened to match Wayne's vehicle, a maroon Toyota 4x4. And 2 hours later, Wayne returned and ransacked the home, stealing a stag-handled hunting knife, a collection of silver dollars, and an elk statue. But Wayne didn't realise that the statue was a one-of-a-kind item made specifically as a gift for Mike from Teresa, or that the knife was also custom-made, given to Mike as a gift from his father. Luke heard movement inside the house and crept out to see what was going on, quickly retreating to his room when he spotted the same man who had attacked his parents earlier that night. Wayne then piled up pieces of furniture and magazines and set them on fire, seemingly intent on destroying any evidence tying him to the attack and killing the children who might be able to recognize his face. However, Mike Shook had built his new home to be airtight, so when Wayne closed the door behind him, he unknowingly cut off the oxygen supply to the fire. Although it failed to properly ignite as he'd planned, it did fill the house with poisonous gases as it smouldered through the night. When Matt finally woke up, he made his way to his younger brother, intending to get their little sister and head to safety. But on their way, the two boys succumbed to the toxic fumes and passed out. The next morning, a family friend arrived to drop his son off, who Teresa had been babysitting. Seeing the smoke, he entered the house with his sleeve covering his mouth. After seeing Mike lying in a pool of blood, he located the 3 children who were all in critical condition. Megan's lungs had collapsed and Matt and Luke were both still unconscious. Getting them to safety, an ambulance arrived and rushed them to hospital where, miraculously, all 3 of them survived and made full recoveries, before going to live with one of their aunties. That Christmas, Wayne would go on to give his father, George, the elk statue he had taken from the Shook home as a gift. Sheriff Dye and the Ravalli County Police, however, hadn't even realised anything was stolen, with the house remaining sealed off as a crime scene for months. As with Wayne's other crimes, there was no physical evidence found at the scene linking him to the attack. Though Luke had seen the intruder and told the police it was someone the family had met before, he couldn't provide them with any specifics to help identify him. They questioned everyone who had worked on the construction of the Shook's home, but it didn't occur to them to speak to anyone who had delivered items, such as their furniture. So they never made the connection to Conlins or Wayne. Even Captain Weatherman had failed to connect the case, despite the use of identical rope binds to some of Wayne's previous attacks. The details of the rope weren't publicly released, and the specifics of Sheriff Dye's investigation weren't even shared with him, being kept contained to a small team of Ravalli County investigators. After 6 months, by July of 1986, the case seemed destined to turn cold. Around the same time, the family of the Shooks were finally allowed back into the house, and upon sorting through their belongings, Mike's father noticed all 3 of the missing items. Though at the time, he didn't bother telling the investigators, having completely lost faith in Sheriff Dye and his team, believing they had mishandled the case from the very start. Knowing they needed to try something different to lure the killer out, Sheriff Dye made the risky decision of releasing false information to the press. He told them that they had physical evidence from a suspect that was currently being tested. Seemingly, this news did actually have an impact on Wayne, because almost immediately after it was published, he began acting strangely. His co-workers at Conlins all saw the shift in his behaviour, especially his boss, Chris Wells. Everyone, including Chris, knew he had a crush on her, and he had made inappropriate advances towards her multiple times in the past. Chris knew he was a little eccentric despite his charm, and had previously been warned by her husband Doug not to encourage him, as he thought there was something off about him. And now more than ever, Chris agreed with him. Wayne was her best worker in the warehouse, but he was suddenly aggressive and temperamental. And with this shift, many of his previous quirks seemed to take on a darker undertone. Wayne had started snapping unwanted photographs of the various women at work, catching them off guard. Chris eventually had to step in and tell him he wasn't allowed to do it anymore. She had no idea that he had an entire photo album filled with pictures of her, many taken secretly as he stalked her, covered in scribbled messages about how much he loved her and how crazy he was about her. Growing paranoid that the police were closing in on him, Wayne had started spiraling. Numerous people in Missoula had strange encounters around this time with him, particularly when he was delivering furniture. On several occasions, he barely spoke to the customers, instead moving through their homes with an unsettling intensity, clearly memorizing every detail. He was searching desperately for his next target. Even Wayne's old friend, Bill Van Cannigan, experienced a strange encounter with someone who, in hindsight, was almost certainly Wayne. One night, he woke to the sound of footsteps in his house, and when he went to investigate armed with a golf club, he saw a shadowy figure bolt out of the house. Whatever was going on inside Wayne's head, he clearly made the decision that Chris Wells, the object of his obsession, was going to be his next target. And so, on September 3rd, 1986, he attacked her husband Doug outside their house, setting into motion a series of events that would lead to his own downfall, as detailed in the opening of this video. Soon after the news broke, the man who had been parked in his truck outside the Wells home came forward, worried he was going to be linked to what had happened. It turned out he had nothing to do with Wayne or the attack, and he had been spying on his girlfriend across the street who he believed was cheating on him before falling asleep. While Doug was severely injured during the attack, there was only one person who died that night. Captain Weatherman was shocked to learn that Wayne had been killed in a failed home invasion, especially given the crime mirrored almost perfectly what had previously happened to the Shook family. So after years of suspecting Wayne may have been the serial killer responsible for the many Jane Does he had been investigating, Captain Weatherman finally had the chance to look through his belongings, and what he found made it clear that his gut and his suspicions had been right all along. After searching his house and workplace, investigators found the stolen items from the Shook house, items only their killer could have had in his possession. They then learned that he had delivered furniture to their house a month before the murders, and that he had sketched a detailed map of their home. They also confirmed that the bullet found in Teresa's leg had been fired by a gun belonging to Wayne's father, George. There was no doubt that Wayne had murdered Mike and Teresa Shook. As well as the map of the Shook house, investigators discovered dozens of hand-drawn maps of other houses and apartments, most of which were confirmed to be homes Wayne had delivered furniture to for Conlins. They also discovered a hair that was found to have the exact same layers of dye on it as the hair of Debbie Deer Creek. They even found a photograph of him and a girl, who Wayne's acquaintances told them was the Robin he had dated, which was later confirmed by a forensic anthropologist to be Debbie, though they still did not manage to formally identify her. Given it seemed clear that Wayne had killed Donna Pounds, this meant they now had evidence tying him to 4 murders, as well as the attack on Chris and Doug. They then discovered that Wayne had been in Seattle when Devonna Nelson had vanished, making him the prime suspect in her murder as well. He was also assumed to be responsible for the murder of Christy Crystal Creek, given how close she was found to his other victims, and how similar her murder appeared to have been. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Wayne, he was never able to be charged for any of his crimes. And to this day, his involvement in several of the cases discussed, as well as several more in the area, is suspected but not definitively proven. In 2005, Robin, also known as Debbie Deer Creek, was finally identified as Marcella Sherry Bachman. Even though Weatherman had retired in the year 2000, he had never stopped searching for her identity, saying that it's one of the most important things law enforcement can do. Her brother Derek had spent years looking for her, going as far as to hire a private investigator. This PI then got in touch with the Green River Task Force, believing she may have been a victim of the Green River Killer. Just like they had done with Devonna, the task force made identifying Marcella possible, this time by obtaining DNA samples from her mother to compare to the many unknown victims they had. When Weatherman submitted a sample from Debbie Deer Creek in 2004 to the University of North Texas, who had been given a federal grant to assist in solving cold cases with DNA, it came back as a match for the sample Marcella's mother had provided to the Green River Task Force. Then, in May 2021, after 36 years, Christy Crystal Creek was also identified. With the use of new modern genetic genealogy techniques, relatives of hers were located, and she was finally revealed to be 23-year-old Janet Lee Lucas from Spokane, Washington. She had last been seen in Idaho in 1983, and nobody knows how or why she ended up in Missoula. Her identification provided closure to her son, who was 5 years old when she vanished, and had spent much of his adult life searching for her. Even now, no one really knows exactly how many lives Wayne took, or what else he might have done, and it's likely some of his secrets will stay hidden forever. For the people of Missoula, that uncertainty still feels raw, even decades later. Wayne Nance wasn't just a killer, he was someone they knew, someone they trusted, and in a place like Missoula, that might be the most frightening thing of all. And with that, our deep dive into the case of the Missoula Mauler comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. And if you found this video interesting, then don't forget to like and subscribe, and feel free to drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts, and to appease the almighty algorithm gods, of course. If you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked below. And I just want to take a moment to give a massive shout out to all of my existing members and Patreon supporters, as it really does mean the world to have you in my corner. Until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.